Good afternoon, everybody. We'll call the Friday afternoon meeting of the Commissioners together. Welcome for all of these, and a special welcome to our new cadet class. Thank you for attending. Okay, the first item on the agenda under staff presentations is New Private Lands Initiative. David Gustafson.
Thank you, Commissioner. Welcome, and get ready for a fun Friday, right? So a lot of talk about things we're doing in the private lands arena, expansions of programs that we're looking forward to here in the next few years, hopefully. So I'm going to go through kind of a brief summary of some of the ideas and the directions that we're trying to take with our private lands habitat program expansions. So just a little bit about the importance of private lands to our mission here in the Pennsylvania Game Commission, that 82% of Pennsylvania's land is privately owned. We are blessed in Pennsylvania with a lot of public land, but it's still only 20% of the total. So, 80% of deer hunters use private lands during hunting seasons. 60% hunt private lands exclusively. So when you think about the importance of private lands, it's important for hunting because that's where a lot of people hunt. But it's also really important for wildlife conservation issues. Greater than 75% of at-risk species we find inhabit private lands in the state, and that only makes sense. So they're critical to providing connectivity across landscapes, and they're critical to providing healthy wildlife populations. The Game Commission's engagement with private landowners is nothing new. Long time ago, we started engaging with private landowners and doing habitat work on private lands as early as the 1930s. Planting habitats, doing grasses, fruit trees, border edge cuts, things like that, as our habitats across Pennsylvania were rejuvenating from the great clear cut of the turn of the century. Things looked a lot different. There was game stocking that occurred on private lands. That work started to scale back as we grew our own state game land system and had to reprioritize our work efforts with our own workforce. I personally can remember just the 1980s when our habitat crews often worked on hunter access cooperator lands doing certain habitat projects. So it's not a new thing, but it has ebbed and flowed over time. Some of the things we've been doing in recent years and things that are ongoing right now is a partnership that we have between Pheasants Forever, the Game Commission, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. We currently provide funding for partner positions that work under the Pheasants Forever flag. Those are 10 biologists, a coordinator, and a forester position, actually, that we're looking to try to get refilled right now. We've been implementing NRCS Farm Bill programs for wildlife benefit through that partnership. That map shows you where those biologist responsibilities are. You can see it's largely in the Susquehanna River kind of watershed area for the most part. We're able to impact about 12,000 acres a year roughly, and it's really focused on habitats and agricultural lands. If you're familiar with NRCS Farm Bill funding programs, they are heavily geared towards agricultural landscapes and agricultural types of habitats. So partner programs, been doing this for quite a while. Other current private lands efforts that we have going on, and we have been for some time, is grants that we've been fortunate to work with partners on through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We kind of abbreviate that NFWF. It started several years ago in the northeast part of the state with the golden wing warbler focus, and that's a golden wing warbler birdie right there. So looking at the importance of habitat management for golden wing warblers, looking at landscape scale forestry impacts, the American Bird Conservancy and partners at Indiana University of Pennsylvania came to us. They were able to leverage a grant through National Fish and Wildlife Foundation at that time to help us create these dynamic forest restoration blocks. So we would use kind of a game lands as the epicenter of that, and then build out onto private lands and conduct private lands habitat management from that. Very successful to the point of we increased that with a Central Appalachian grant, and then also a grant in the southwest part of the state that the Ruffed Grouse Society is helping us manage. So we now have partnerships with Pheasants Forever, Ruffed Grouse Society, American Bird Conservancy, where we're focusing habitat management on healthy forests, healthy grasslands. These give us more flexibility than the NRCS programs and the Farm Bill funding. There's a lot more freedom to maneuver in the types of habitats and the places on the ground that we can do work. And we've been impacting over 2,000 acres a year on private lands through those programs over the last several years. So where are we now and where do we want to go? A couple of years ago, as our funding streams within the agency started to build, we recognized that we maybe have some opportunities now to go out and work with private landowners again in a way that we haven't in a long time. We worked internally and we had an approved private lands expansion program plan that was going to start in fiscal 24, which starts July 1 upcoming. And it was supposed to be a 3-year plan. Our idea at the time was to simply expand that Pheasants Forever partnership and add more positions to it and spread them out across the state. As we looked and communicated with staff, we discovered that we might be limiting ourselves if we do that. That maybe there was more opportunities to work in greater spaces than just those agricultural programs and focused on farm bill programs. So we decided we'd like to see the Game Commission take a little more ownership of this program and really make it ours. And let the citizens of the Commonwealth know who we are as a leader in wildlife management, not only in the state, but in surrounding states, and work with our partners in other states to bring some attention to what we're doing. So we recrafted that proposal into a more significant expansion of our private lands program. I'll get into that in depth here in a few, but essentially what we're thinking and what we're looking forward to is establishing private lands planning teams in each region of the state, potentially having some habitat implementation staff going out and doing things on private lands, and leveraging funding where we could potentially pay for private lands habitat work to occur through a contracted services basis that we would administer as the agency on behalf of a private landowner that would be a willing partner. A lot of devil in the details in that, though, as you might imagine. To start off, though, I really want to talk about what the focus of this is going to be about. And make no mistake, it's not simply just going to be us going out and planting food plots for folks on their ground. That's not what this is directed to do. We really want to try to find the best ways to fill gaps in existing funding programs. There's no point in duplicating effort. We already have all these partnerships. We already have these farm bill programs and other funding sources. We have NIFWIF programs. We really want to focus on finding those gaps in places that are unfulfilled where we can then step in. And we're prioritizing the species of greatest conservation need in this effort. As we start to build this out, our intent is to have regional prioritization rankings and models that show which species are important where and what land bases give us the best opportunities for success to keep common species common and to keep and to try to move the needle a little bit and take some of these species that maybe aren't so common and give them some support they need to maybe make a comeback. So that's the focus of what we're trying to accomplish with this. It's not just general random throw money out there to do whatever kind of habitat projects people might want. It's going to be focused. And again, we want to use our planning teams first to direct landowners to those most appropriate partners that we already have. We want to make maximum use of those partnership programs and the funding that's already in place before we start stepping in and then filling those needs. Oops. Take a drink quick. So to start, our idea is to have these habitat planning teams in the regions. And what our thought is to have 2-person teams to develop wildlife habitat and forest management plans for private landowners. In the past, we've had wonderful biologists that have worked for this agency that have engaged with private landowners and done planning efforts for them. But we haven't been able to get a lot of those to an implementation phase. We just haven't been able to get over the hump. We get out there, we engage with the landowners, we educate them, we get them excited about things, and then we can't get the next step of accomplishing the management plan goals and objectives for habitat. It seems like where we stall out a lot. So what we're hopeful is that we can build a team of, we're thinking a biologist and a forester working together as a team to build plans that would be certified and eligible for Farm Bill funding programs first and foremost, because that's really important. There's a critical step there. You have to be a certified plan writer to write acceptable plans for those programs. We want to coordinate and collaborate with all those partner efforts that we have going on. That team would administrate any contracted services habitat projects that the agency would fund. And possibly we would end up with multiple teams in each region that would be responsible for a discrete geographic area. There may be some regions that have a lot of opportunity for these private lands type of endeavors, and other regions that maybe not so much. I think the North Central, it's got a lot more public land, right? Northwest, Southwest, a lot more private lands, different opportunities. You have wetlands, a lot of wetland opportunities in the Northwest part of the state. You have very different opportunities in the South Central part of the state. So there's going to be some teasing out of that need-based kind of expansion of staff to meet those needs. Oops. Habitat implementation teams, this is something that's probably phase 2. This is probably down the line a little ways after we get these planning teams in place and really start building that pipeline of potential partner landowners and potential projects. But we could potentially augment our own habitat crews with additional folks that could go out there and do work on private lands, much like our habitat crews used to do, as I mentioned before, on hunter access properties back years and years ago. So it's, again, not new, nothing different than what we've done in the past. It's just been a long time since we've actually been able to do it. And again, carrying out those habitat management plans on the private lands team, or on the private lands that's developed by that planning team. What else is this going to take? It's obviously going to take some supporting staff. So we're going to have to add some supervisory roles to manage this program if it gets as big as we think it could. Possibly some clerical staff, HR, admin. Anytime you're adding this much, you have automated technology needs and things. So we don't want to be deaf to the fact that there's going to take some support behind this. It can't just be all action stuff. It's going to take, you can contract things out and get a lot more done through contracts, but you still have to have somebody to administer all those contracts. And as you do more and more and more, that workload, that burden becomes bigger and bigger. So we want to make sure we staff up appropriately for that as well. In a little diagram here that was put together by our staff, and I'm going to take a stop here for a second and just say that what I'm presenting here is not my work completely. I mean, this is John Tauscher in our private lands team has done the lion's share of pulling this together. Scott Bear, regional staff come together, wildlife management staff. It's been a collective effort of all of our folks trying to strategize and synthesize all of this stuff together into a meaningful format. I'm just the guy up here talking about it today. So wanted to make sure that I didn't miss out on that. But really this diagram kind of showing that bottom tier 1 is that like general information. That's where everybody starts. Every landowner that we engage with would probably start there. And maybe some of them are just looking for some backyard habitat information or some education or some engagement. Then you move up to the habitat planning where maybe we're connecting those people to partner things. And then tier 3, and you can see that's a smaller piece of the triangle. Really, that's probably the place where we start leveraging our funding and getting out there and doing work on the ground with our staff. Like I said, that tier 1, everybody's there. Backyard habitat engagement. Maybe they get some seedlings, some nest boxes. We get these folks engaged with the Game Commission's mission about who we are and what we do for wildlife. That tier 2, maybe this is a landowner that has a meaningful size piece of ground and they've got something that's set up perfect for some grassland redevelopment or something like that. And we partner them up with the most appropriate place. And then the biggest thing with these landowners that would fall into this category would be kind of holding their hand and walking them through the processes that it takes to leverage Farm Bill NRCS funding. Because that's a huge hurdle as well. If anybody's ever tried to walk through any of those types of funding sources, there's a lot of red tape in there. There's a lot of steps, a lot of things in the process, and we can't expect landowners to take on that burden on their own. So we would propose to help them through and navigate to get to the place where the funding is applied and the habitat work actually gets done on the ground. And then, like I said, that last tier, these are maybe our bigger landowners, maybe our cooperative access cooperators. I think of things like Bethlehem Water Authority, where we have management agreements where we work with them, Collins Pine. We have these large owners that they have an individual focus, but we have a management agreement with them, and maybe there's something we can do to leverage our funding to get something done that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So that would be that tier 3. And really the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve with this is really create a nationally recognized private lands program. I think there is an opportunity here in Pennsylvania. I think we have the right people. I think we have the right partners. And I think we have the right landscape to create something really special. Improve public awareness about wildlife and their habitat issues. I think that's an outreach thing that we can work a lot better. You know, our new marketing team's producing great things in social media and digital media. How do we then continue to connect with those landowners that need that information? And we think this could be a nexus for that. Increasing agency relevance so that people know we are the go-to source for habitat management, right? Not that we don't have partners out there doing great things and educating folks about habitat management, but we are Pennsylvania's wildlife agency, and people should know that, and people should know that they can come to us for this information and this work. And really put meaningful habitat improvements on the ground at landscape scales. And this is where that modeling, that prioritization, that connectivity type of thing, this is where that comes together. And instead of doing random acts of habitat all over the landscape in a disjunct way, how can we build connectivity among landowners connected to private lands and public lands and really build meaningful connectivity? I think of things like snowshoe hare, like grouse, where connecting those kind of isolated populations that exist on the landscape in places now is critical to their long-term survival. So if we can build that connectivity through meaningful habitat work, I think that's a huge goal and a huge outcome that we want to see happen here. And really, again, just expanding that engagement with our largest stakeholder in the state, the private landowner. So where are we at right now? It's been a lot of work has gone into this over the last year or so. Coming up and formulating these ideas, figuring out what we think might work, what we want to avoid. It's difficult to know kind of how to roll out all these plans. We're working at senior staff, executive staff, working with the commissioners here. We've got the approval to move forward with this expansion concept. Now it gets down into rolling up the sleeves and which paperwork has to be filed where and which position goes first. You know, how do we navigate the OA process and the hiring process and all those kinds of things. Building contract templates for certain habitat projects that we're going to put on the ground with landowners. That's kind of where we're at right now. So working out some of the budgeting analysis and coordination. And like I said earlier, this is probably going to be implemented in phases. Really looking at getting those planning teams in place first, start building those connections. As we develop the need or the awareness, then we can sense where we have to expand with funding or with more assets in one place, maybe more than another. And I don't think we can predetermine that. I think we've got to build into it slowly and figure out where the needs are and then target those needs. So that's where we are today in the private lands program expansion. So I'm happy to take any questions or any questions you might have.
Dave, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Can you give us an example of something you might be thinking of doing? You know, just a kind of a project. Just give us an idea.
So
of what,
a good one would be, you know, in the South Central region in particular, in the Ridge and Valley Province area, we have those rocky, craggy ridge tops where we have a lot of game lands and then we have broken private lands and things like that. One of our species of greatest conservation need, the Allegheny wood rat, exist on plenty of private land places in that landscape. So as I mentioned, focusing on species of greatest conservation need, how could we go out there and maybe engage with a landowner and say, look, we'd like to build habitat structures for wood rats or do certain habitat practices to help these wood rats expand or maintain their populations and maybe provide connectivity to existing game lands population nearby. So whether that's placing boulders or doing supplemental, you know, food source things for wood rats, things like that. So another one maybe on, for instance, in the northern tier where we would have, say, a big industrial timber landowner that may be focused on managing their timber, but let's say they have a creek drainage that comes down through their property that then continues down through a game lands. Building connectivity through that landscape might be really important for things like woodcock, managing invasive species or non-commercial timber assets that they may have that are out of their timber productivity basket, but down, let's say, in a floodplain area. Can we get in there and help them do some woodcock management where they wouldn't normally do that because it's not a revenue generating thing for them, but they would love to see it happen, they just can't fund it. So maybe there's a place there where we can jump in. So those are a couple things off the top of our heads that we'd be looking at doing.
Dave.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Bob, you jumped me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm just joking.
Sorry about that, Todd. You got me all excited. Dave, the opportunity to become involved in this, is that only available to like hunter access properties, or is that to anyone that's interested?
No, so great question. And exactly one of the points of this is that we want to make sure this is available to any landowners that have the habitats that need managed for the wildlife that are there. So when you think of species of greatest conservation need, you can't force where they end up. You have to manage them where they're at. So if a landowner has a property that has an opportunity for us to make meaningful impacts, they will be eligible. Open hunting access won't necessarily be a requirement. But certainly when it would come to looking at what we fund and where we fund it, I think there would be rankings and prioritizations somehow that we would have to determine. I think open access for hunting is a thing that we all care about. But we don't want to miss opportunities to manage for these species of greatest conservation need by being blind to the fact that we don't necessarily need to have open hunter access to do great things for wildlife. So,
Thanks, Dave.
Dave, I got a couple of questions, but one, this is a great initiative. I mean, we've heard about this, quite a bit over the last couple of months, and I'm also on the We Can Serve PA's Policy Council, and would really like to see, this be a part of ongoing, presentations and others. And relative to that, in terms of potential partners, is the possibility or potential of incorporating conservation and agricultural easement information part of your plans and reaching out to landowners, or in terms of that education process?
are you saying people that are already registered within the agricultural easement programs?
No, those that, don't know about it.
Oh, don't know about it. I would say any and all options are on the table in regard to how we can connect people with any program out there that might be beneficial to them. And I think that's going to come down to that nuance in region by region.
Yep.
And the planning teams that we establish in those regions really becoming the experts of the important programs in their locale, right? Where those ag easement things might be really important in that area. We may have another area where other programs are really important. So those planning teams will be the epicenter at the region level to really connect landowners with those appropriate programs. So there's going to be some education and training on our end to get our own staff up to speed with what those all are. And we'll certainly be looking for input and information from any and all of our partners to bring that to the table for us to hear and figure out how it fits in.
Yeah. The other thing that I think could be helpful, because I know with some of the information that's been shared with some of our elected officials, the question comes up of, why are we potentially investing resources on private lands? I think an FAQ segment of how you present could be helpful. I mean, I know you talk about, certain things that this is not going to touch on or is not through, various segments of the presentation, but I think that could be really helpful.
Excellent, yeah, duly noted. And I think, again, too, to make, and if I didn't say this, to assuage any perceptions that we're not taking away from what we're doing on state game lands.
Right.
We're doing more now in habitat work on state game lands than we've ever done in modern history. We're doing more habitat work on the yearly than we've ever done. And we're going to continue to do that. But we've been blessed with some financial resources now that we have the ability to grow these other programs, and we really felt strongly that this was a place to go with that.
Absolutely.
So,
This is great. Thank you.
Dave, question. A lot of comments or questions I get from private landowners deals with burning. They're always asking, can we contact the Game Commission and help us burn plan or actually burn it for us? Would that be part of this initiative as well? As that separate?
So we're hopeful that this will help us grow what is now called the Certified Prescribed Burn Manager Program. So we're working with the Pennsylvania Prescribed Fire Council to develop a certification so that folks can attain the certification to become a certified prescribed burn manager to be able to do fire on private lands. I think the intent in the future is that will go from the Prescribed Fire Council to legislation so the DCNR would be able to oversee and supervise that. Okay. Right now it's housed at the Prescribed Fire Council, but yes, we are hopeful that we can get this private lands burning program rolling as well, and maybe this can be catalytic in that process.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions of
Yeah,
Dave?
Dave, I have a question. I'm not sure how to articulate it, and I understand that you're in the planning stage, the very, very beginning, so I'm not exactly sure how to articulate my question, but let me start off by saying I fully support the program. I wish you all the luck in putting a good one together. The big question that comes to my mind, an awful lot of our public access properties are industrial properties.
Mhm.
And we're talking about improving habitats for threatened and endangered species, species of concern. Are we going to do anything to try to avoid the companies getting in a jam as far as a natural diversity index? Are we going to create pindy hits? Are they going to be able to back out if we invest a lot of money in their property that they allow us for use for public recreation? Are we going to give them a back out point?
So I think there's a lot to that question. I appreciate it though, because again, I mean, as much work as we've done and as much thought as we put into this, we certainly haven't answered all the questions yet.
Right.
And I appreciate that. And that's important to bring to the forefront. I think the intent would be that if we're connecting somebody with funding to get some habitat work done, that there's a commitment of follow through for some period of time. Certainly we wouldn't want to be dumping money into a piece of property and then have them have the ability to back out. I think of things like the CREP program, where you sign into an agreement of a certain term if you're going to take the money to do habitat work on the property. So I think there's models that would show, how we could make those arrangements. I think when it comes to PNDI hits and things like that, if we all of a sudden start growing some of these species, maybe they don't become PNDI hits anymore. If we do enough, maybe they're no longer a PNDI hit, but because they become more common.
And
So
I'm just concerned that's a question
sure.
that might come from the General Assembly.
Well, and I think that's important that any of the landowners that would want to engage with a program like this, ultimately it's their land. They have the decision of whether or not they would want to engage in this. We're not putting our foot down and leveraging anybody. We're certainly going to knock on some doors and try to encourage some things to occur. But I don't know that we're going to put any pressure on somebody if they say, no, we're not really interested because we're worried about the impacts it might have on our ability to achieve our goals and objectives.
Nobody has a crystal ball. And
Exactly, yeah.
This guy has 500 acres and he loves wildlife.
Yeah.
And he wants improvements made on his property. He doesn't realize that he's going to be unitized in the next 5 years. And I just wanted to bring it up so that you guys,
Certainly going to have it in the mix of when we start
Yeah.
putting, like I said, building those contractual arrangement documents and things like that. Certainly things we're going to have to talk about with the team.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Got another one for you, Dave. Based off of some of your pictures up there, I'm assuming that when we get to the habitat implementation team phase of this, they're going to be looking primarily at non-commercial work. How is that gonna? You see where I'm going with
Yep.
that?
So I think I know where you're going, so
Yeah.
I'll try to jump on it.
Yep.
What we don't want to do is give the impression that we're trying to get in the way of anybody else that's out there doing something like a consulting forester. So if we would engage with a landowner that says, hey, I have this property, and in our management plan, it would call for a timber harvest, that may be a commercial timber harvest. We're going to try to connect them with reputable consulting foresters out there that can then take care of that part of the process for them. We don't want to usurp those folks out there. There's all those folks out there already doing great things. So if we can get that landowner towards doing something that they might not have thought of doing otherwise, and then we can say, hey, as part of this, you could do a commercial timber harvest, generate some revenue for yourself, make this awesome grouse habitat. Here's a list of consulting foresters in your area that you can go ahead and contact, but here's the plan that you want to hand them of what your expectations of what they're going to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I just wanted to make sure, that we're clear that we're not going to be starting to broker commercial timber sales.
No, not at all.
On private land.
We may come up with a wildlife management plan that, as part of that, would encourage the landowner to do a timber harvest.
Right.
But at that point, we would be handing that off to the landowner to allow them to engage with a consultant or whatever path they would choose. If they wanted to hire their local lumber company that had a forester to come out there and do the timber harvest for them, that's certainly their prerogative. And we definitely don't want to stand in the way of that. We simply want to give them the plan and say, here's the habitat you're trying to achieve, and here's the methods that we think you should do to get there.
Good, thank you.
Dave, what kind of consideration have you given to how you're gonna prioritize what work you do? And how much money would you invest in, just say, a particular,
Yeah, so I think as we build these regional planning teams, there's going to have to be a lot of thought and prioritization and strategy put into what the focus in a given geography is going to be, what species we want to focus on, what habitat types that we need in that given geography. And I think then beyond that, any habitat projects that would come up, we would have to develop prioritization and ranking as to what would be the highest priority for us to spend the money on. And I don't think we would want to, kind of set any expectations that it's just an open checkbook by any stretch. I mean, we certainly still have to be fiscally responsible and make sure that any monies we would spend fall in line with the cost of services for doing similar things, anywhere else on game lands, for instance. So it's pretty broad. I think that, establishing like native grasses or something like that, we know what the price points are for that, right? Doing non-commercial, thinning in a forested stand. We have a pretty good idea of a range of prices for that. So we would certainly, leverage all that knowledge we have to make sure we were staying in line. Hopefully that answers what your question is.
I was just thinking how successful this program could be. And as you know, I do participate in some of the national farm
Yep.
programs and so forth. And I know they have a priority set of, what they want to do, like you're talking about, and where and so forth. But you get on a list and you wait until you come up or whatever. I just wondered if you've given any thought to that type of thing.
Yeah, we have. We've started working with the team between our staff and wildlife management staff as to what those specific, and again, geography is going to play a lot into this. What species occur in various places in the South Central are certainly not going to be the same things we might prioritize in the Northwest. And even within the region, there may be spots in the Northwest over on the plateau on the east side of their region that may be really focused on things like snowshoe hare and grouse, where you go further west, where maybe way more focused on wetlands and moist soil habitats and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of that's going to have to go into that prioritization model. But we got a great team between the biologists, the habitat management staff, the GIS folks that are really good at developing these types of models. And we've got great partners and great models out there, Rough Grouse Society, reaching out to those folks and others to help us make those prioritization models. I think we can get to a really good place, and certainly willing to hear any input on that.
Okay, anything else for Dave? We
Thank
thank you, Dave, and appreciate your time. And thank you to your team. Next up is the shooting range grant program. Todd Holmes.
All right, good afternoon, commissioners, fellow PGC staff, and others. My name's Todd Holmes. I'm the Shooting Sports Division Chief here at the Game Commission. If you're not familiar with the Shooting Sports Division, we're the newest division in the Bureau of Marketing and Strategic Communication. Shooting sports has grown significantly in the last 10 years in the United States. I think our agency recognizes that more now than ever, which brings us to what we're going to talk about a little bit today. I will preface this is a draft. We've only been at this a couple months, so we're still working through a lot of this, but I feel like we have a really good foundation to build off of here, and I'll kind of give you some of the focal points. So we have the range improvement program, and the emphasis of this is going to be we're going to build the shooting sports industry and wildlife conservation at the same time by encouraging more people to get involved in participating. Many of you know the Pittman-Robertson dollars that our agency receives comes directly from firearms and ammunition and archery-related sales, which directly benefits our agency and our missions. By continuing to invest in our hunters and shooters, it ensures the future of conservation. Many of our clubs across the state in dire need of renovations and safety upgrades. If you've been to a sportsman's club anytime in the near future, a lot of their members are aging, as are the grounds and the facilities. So there's no better time to provide them with some financial support than now. The improvements are an investment for not only our future generations of hunters and shooters, but also in the Commonwealth. So the Game Commission grant program aims to increase exposure to our state's shooting sports resources while providing funding to grow access and safety across the Commonwealth. Our agency will work hand in hand with the shooting sports industry, including NGOs as NSSF, to offer a competitive grant to many sportsmen's clubs and ranges across Pennsylvania. Our agency is committed to roll out this range improvement program over the next 5 years and dedicate up to $25 million, $5 million a year. So some of the areas of focus that you'll see within this program are existing range rehabilitation and remodeling, new range construction and range addition, range design consultation, creating better accessibility to ranges, increasing access and opportunities, options to offer new shooter classes and workshops, options to host hunter and shooter education courses, create more user-friendly ranges that cater to both hunters and recreational shooters. Eligible projects would also include development and redevelopment and relocation, noise abatement structures, construction of backstops and safety berms, sky and noise baffles, shooting stations and covers, training, storage, and clubhouse facilities, access roads, parking lots, safety fencing, target systems, signage, and lead remediation. We're hopeful that in year one we'll start a pilot program. We're hoping one project per region will be selected with a total of up to 12 across the state, so possibly up to 2 per region. These pilot projects will have a cap of $30,000 to begin with. Final details on not only the program but also the pilot program we're hoping to have available in mid-May, and we're hopeful that this program starts June 1st, 2024. I know that was a really quick, and I was a little bit nervous, so apologize. But if you have any questions, I'll surely try to answer them now.
Todd, what region are you looking to start first? What area? Or you haven't selected a site?
So I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
I'm open to all. You know, statewide, as far as I'm concerned, is just as important. I don't know that there's any one that's any a priority over the others, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, well,
Southeast.
Yeah.
Yeah, southeast.
Yeah.
How do people get in touch with you to apply?
So we're working through some of the processes with this, but I think it's going to be an online application process. We will make it available as a hard copy too, so in case you have club members that aren't internet savvy, you know, there'll be a hard copy that they could send in as well.
Todd, I'd like to, first of all, congratulate you and your staff on the outstanding program for the NASP competition that was held down in Lancaster. You guys made me very proud. That was awesome to see that many students. And you told me, what was the number on that? How many students do we have?
So we had 2 state tournaments that day. One, we had 965 kids participate, and the other one was just under 300, so 1,300.
And how many schools?
60-ish total.
Great.
Yep.
Good stuff. My question to you, you said that there would be grants available to NGOs. Like, for example, the National Wild Turkey Federation, they have youth field days throughout the state. Would that be something that would qualify for a grant?
So I think it would work in tandem with it. And one of the things that I didn't necessarily mention in here, but will go along as Dade mentioned with their program, is there's going to be a commitment to the club that receives the funds. And they'll have certain deliverables they have to meet. And some of those deliverables will include things like youth field days, junior pheasant hunts, or hunter trapper education courses, shooter education courses, things like that. So while the NWTF may not directly receive funding from us for such programs, their local clubs that utilize them or their members are part of would benefit by being able to host, you know, events like that.
So, for example, we have a club on Lonnie Rod and Gun Club, and they host our event. So they would be the one to apply for the grant that would benefit the youth field day?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep. Absolutely.
thank you.
Sure.
Are you familiar with where that range is in that picture?
Me?
Yeah.
Yes.
What's the maximum distance there?
That's Mifflin County Sportsman's Club. I believe they have a 1,000-yard range.
Again, it's a sportsman's club. Is it Sportsman's Club?
Yes, yep.
Are you, and if you're planning, prepared to have something like that on our lands, our game lands?
As far as a 1,000-yard shooting range?
Long range, say
Sure,
500?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm a shooting sports guy, so that's my realm there. So if we had a 1,000-yard shooting
Really? I'd have
range,
never guessed.
yeah, I mean, if we had one of these, if we had several of these, I'd be thrilled. And I do think people would enjoy using them. So
I do too.
I agree.
One in a region would be wonderful.
you're speaking my language.
Just out of curiosity, just say we would have one in a region. What would we do as a state agency to take care of safety on a long-range shooting range?
So because we don't have any super long ranges right now in Pennsylvania, there are other states that do, and they have incorporated safety protocols that they've been using for decades. So I would lean on other states that have long distance ranges and see how they run and operate, how the lanes are set up, the range layout is, whether they're using signage or hot cold signs, gates. There's a lot of different things when you start to get that far out that you need to make and keep in mind to keep the range safe at all times. So I would lean on some of the other states that have had long distance
Okay.
ranges open.
You just had to put a semi-automatic rifle in there, didn't you?
Sure, yeah, it's a rifle. Every rifle counts.
That's right.
Todd, question, I may have missed this from the first slide, but is this also indoor ranges as well as outdoor?
Sure, yeah,
Okay.
it can cover any.
Okay.
Yep, in fact, the shooting sports division the last 2 days spent time getting our NRA rifle certification at Mechanicsburg, and we utilized a 22 indoor range the last 2 days, which was super nice because the weather wasn't great. So any range, each of those ranges are helping fund our PR allotment and funding the excise tax, so they're all eligible.
All right. And is it just NGOs and nonprofits, or does it include small businesses?
So that's a great question, and something we're probably going to have to figure out here in the next couple weeks, but it's something we have discussed, and we haven't come up to a definitive decision on that yet.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Other questions of Todd? Well, Todd, we thank you, and with the amount of PR funding we get to give back that funding or some of the funding for these programs, I thank you, and I believe we're all supportive of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up on the agenda is 2425 elk license allocation. Jeremy Banfield.
Yo, buddy.
All right. Good morning, commissioners, executive staff, everybody else in the room. I know most of you personally, but again, my name's Jeremy Banfield. I'm the elk biologist with the Game Commission. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. This is my annual song and dance on elk for you guys, but I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. I will be brief. I'm going to quickly go through, or I'm going to review our annual population estimate because that drives a lot of the tag allocations that we end up recommending, and then I'll pull that into our license recommendations for this year. So again, I think most of you are familiar with this, but we we use an aerial survey to estimate our elk population annually. The plane itself is equipped with a fairly sophisticated camera. It's got a combination infrared, so thermal, as well as a high definition daytime camera, and that's what you're seeing there, switch back and forth. The real magic is that it also has a bunch of overlays of information on it. So upper left there is the date and time. It's cut off a little bit, but bottom left is the position of the aircraft, and I apologize, we're actually looking at the wheel right now. There it goes, okay. Bottom left is the position of the aircraft, and then bottom right, it's also cut off a little bit, is the position of where the camera is looking. So at any point in space and time, we have the data on where the plane is, where they're looking, and then of course the date and time as well. It's all geo-reference stabilized. We get all of this footage on an external hard drive. It's about 90 hours, and I get the honor of going through all of that on an annual basis to come to our tag allocations. So flight paths and what that looks like, these are 500-meter transects. The red outline there is our elk management area. The black is the survey area, and then the purple lines are the actual flight paths. You can see that they base out of State College, the airport there. And then the point of showing you this is just to say that they do have pretty good coverage across the entire survey area of the elk range. Yellow dots are proportional observations, and then quick summary here, we had 25 days of flights this year, 33 different surveys, 11,000 miles, and 133 groups observed. We use our radio collared animals to estimate the proportion of the population that they miss. So we know where a single radio collar is in a certain date and time at a certain place. And then, like I said earlier, we can see where the plane is at a certain date and time, and if those things match up, that radio collar was seen. Conversely, again, we know a radio collar is in a field somewhere, plane flies right past, that animal was not seen, and it's that ratio of animals that were seen versus unseen that gives us our detection rate. That detection rate combined with the overall total of observations that they make is then forced through an equation, and that gives us our annual population estimate. So this year, 87 collars, they saw 54 of them. That's 62% detection rate. That's pretty much on par with our long-term average. That's the last column over there on the right. Last year, we did see a higher detection rate, but that had to be an anomaly because over the past 5 years, it's been pretty consistent, right around about 60%. And that equates to a estimate of about 1,500 elk. Looking at that graphically through the years, if we put a line through that, we've got slow to maybe subtle increasing, probably stable, but maybe subtle increasing population. And then here's what I really want to highlight. If we draw a box over those confidence intervals, they overlap very heavily. That's good. So true population is probably oscillating somewhere around in there, somewhere around 1,400 animals, maybe give or take 150. So when people ask me, I usually say between 1,300 and 1,400 animals, knowing that I'm being both truthful and conservative. How does that actually go into our tag allocation? We use a pretty simple model. So again, we start with that annual population, 1,500-ish. We go through, we multiply that by the non-harvest survival rate, right? So that's everything that removes an elk from the landscape outside of legal harvest. We then subtract off harvest, and that's the number of elk that we want to see removed on an annual basis. We do inflate that number based on traditional success rates, so 70% for cows, about 95% for bulls. And then there's a subjective conflict adjustment where we float it out to the local wardens in the regions that have elk in their districts. And then we say, you know, are you guys experiencing any crop damage? Are you experiencing issues with residential damage, things like that? And they will come back to us with recommendations of, like, they'd like to see a few more elk killed in this zone and maybe let a few of them go in another zone or something like that. And then all of that repeats itself based on the annual recruitment that we get from reproduction in cows. So what does that model produce? If we project it out 5 years, this is what it looks like. And based on our management plan, that objective at the bottom there is to maintain a stable or increasing elk population. And that's essentially what we're doing, right? So this is based on our recommended licenses that I'll get to in 1 second here. But we've got roughly flat line, maybe slightly increasing over the next 5 years. Related to that, second part of this is also that the management plan also requires or calls for at least 25 branch bulls per 100 cow. We've been a little bit over that for the past several years. The observed ratios are in the upper left there, that table. And then our projected ratios, again, based on our tag allocations that I'm going to get to in 1 second here. I promise I will actually get to them. I keep mentioning them. I'm just trying to build suspense, you know, keep you guys interested here. Based on our projections into the future here, that's the bottom right table. We should get closer to that target within about 5 years. I don't want to go screaming toward that target, but slowly ease into it. So that brings us to this. Total of 65 bulls and then 75 cows. Again, that's split across our 3 hunting seasons. Archery is the last part of September. General season, first full week in November. Late season is the first week of January the following year. And then there's 14 separate hunt zones. If you're looking close, hunt zone 1 is absent here. That is because anybody with a valid license can also hunt zone 1. So it doesn't have a specific allocation given to it, but anybody that has a license can also hunt that. And then hunt zone 7 is the area around the Elk Country Visitor Center, and we don't put any tags there. Comparing that to last year, we're basically the same, all right? Identical to bulls from last year, 65. We dropped a little bit on cows. The big disparity between 2022 and 2023, if you're looking there, if you recall from last year, we did get some new data on calf survival, so we dropped pretty significantly there. But essentially, we're about the same as we were last year. And with that, I will take any questions on our recommendations for the tags.
Jeremy, I have a couple questions, not just on the tags, but it's on the earlier slide. One of the early aerial slides, it showed, I guess, 2 bulls and 28 others. What were the others?
That's a good question. I should just take that out of there. So those are my notes, right? I told you I go through all the video. I have some video editing software, and I just link that up so that I can see it. The aerial survey is really good at being able to identify bulls because there's no heat to the antlers, but a lot of times, even if there's not daytime imagery, a lot of times you will see a shadow from the antler get cast across the heat of the body. So the point of the story is the survey can split branched bulls and then everything else. And everything else would include cows, spikes, and then calves. They can't really separate those from the air. We actually supplement the aerial survey with a ground-based survey where we drive designated routes and then we break those groups down and we apply that ratio to that other group. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah,
Okay.
it's helpful. And just last question, one of the other slides, I think, if I'm correct, on the diagram where you showed the harvest success, it showed, I guess, cow success at 70% and bull at 94%. What's the, I guess, contribute to the difference between those percentages?
Yeah, that's a good question. So traditionally, not always, but traditionally most bull hunters do hire a guide. It does make a difference if you hire a guide, at least some. And cow hunters, I'm not exactly sure why there is a huge disparity there, but I will say that weather plays a role, hunter age plays a role, things like that. But in general, most of the bull hunters end up hiring a guide, which is probably what drives that success
Okay.
rate up.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Jeremy, there seems to be a lot of movement in introduction of elk into Midwestern and Eastern states, Virginia, Kentucky. Do you know what they're maintaining as a population in Kentucky?
I don't think they know. They'd probably be offended if they just heard me say that in a public Board of Commissioners meeting. Their estimate is between 12 and 15,000.
That's what I
That's
thought.
pretty broad.
I mean, is that reasonable? How do they do that? Come on, answer the question.
They typically use a spreadsheet model, which is kind of similar to what we do, but they don't validate it with an aerial survey. And I don't know the ins and outs of it because I don't work for that state, but I know that that's their general estimate. So, 12 to 15,000 is probably reasonable, but it's pretty broad.
Uh-huh. And how many did they move into Virginia?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Not very
It was
many.
around 200, I think.
Yeah.
Virginia hasn't brought any in recently. West Virginia is still actively moving elk into
They are.
their state. Yes, their governor recently asked them to move in more.
You have any idea what they're shooting for?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. They're not even anywhere close to a huntable population yet. I think they're around 300 at the moment.
I apologize.
I can get you the numbers
No,
exactly.
I apologize for
I don't-
asking you out-of-state questions. I'm just curious.
I actually have a table with all of their estimate. We do it
Really?
every year. We send each other, the estimates from our different states. But I can get you that information.
All right. I just find it interesting. I think you're doing an outstanding job. I think everybody here agrees. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just want to echo what Commissioner Frederick said. I live in the area, and Jeremy, not only is it a hunting resource, which you're presenting today, but I can't believe the amount of people that exponentially ramps up every year off of Interstate 80 from all over God's creation for 3 to 4 months of the year. So thank you for all your work in keeping the herd healthy and balanced, and it's not only valuable to the hunters, but the broad public in general. So we thank you as a commissioner group.
Thank you, sir. And just to chime in there, because I can try and recover from not knowing the other states' populations, it's about 500,000 people that go up there on an annual basis. There's
Wow.
actually a traffic counter on the visitor center driveway, and so it's roughly 500,000 people, most of them during September, October, obviously.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Jeremy? Thank you again. Next up is the 24-25 antlerless deer license allocation. David Stainbrook.
Okay, I guess they don't care about deer. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you, commissioners. Today I'll be going over the antlerless deer allocations for this next coming season. But I also have another topic I want to bring up at the end, which is an update, an exciting new update we can do for making our antlerless buying process a little bit easier this year. So we're excited to go through that. So the Game Commission has publicly identified and supported deer management goals. These include a healthy and sustainable deer population, acceptable levels of deer-human conflicts, a healthy and sustainable forest habitat, and provide recreational opportunity and improve our information and education. So these goals are supported by both Pennsylvania hunters and the broader public here in Pennsylvania. And these goals help guide us in making our antlerless license allocation recommendations. So the deer management goals and the data determine our deer population objective for each unit. And we look at over 750,000 data points and work through a defined decision process to determine if our goals are being met and to determine the deer population objective. And that's basically whether we want to increase deer numbers, decrease deer numbers, or stabilize deer populations, keep them where they're at in each of our units. So let's take a look at each of our goals and the data that we use. For the goal of managing deer for a sustainable population, we look at fawn to doe ratios in our harvest data. We look at our population trends, and we look at the presence of disease, such as CWD in our free-ranging deer in each of our units. In the map on the left top, you can see the stable population trends pretty much statewide. That's all the units that you see there in the light green color. The exception there being units 2B and 2A that are in the darker green. Those two have an increasing population trend that we saw the same thing last year, and we have an objective to stabilize that increase. Unit 4A was the only unit that showed a decreasing fawn to doe ratio in the harvest, but the population trend there is stable, and the objective has been to decrease deer numbers there because of CWD. And then the units highlighted in orange on the map on the right are the units where we have detected CWD in wild deer. Unit 4C is the new addition here. We had a detection last year that occurred after we already had our allocations set. That was one of the reasons that we had that expansion of the season in DMAP area. Now we can go back to the original process where we deal with that through allocations. The objective in these units has been to decrease deer populations. However, as you can see on the map on the top left, the population trends are stable in all of those units where we have CWD, despite that objective to reduce deer populations there. For the goal of managing deer for sustainable forests, we look at data on forest regeneration and deer forest impacts. These are collected by the U.S. Forest Service. Unfortunately, data are unavailable from the most recent year, so we are showing the most recent data that is available to us. On the left, you see the fair forest regeneration, most of our units. It is poor in Unit 2D and good regeneration in Units 2F, 3B, and 5A. For the deer impact measure that's on the right, we see acceptable deer forest impacts in all of our units except for in 2C and 3D where the impacts are too high. And for the goal of acceptable deer-human conflicts, we use survey data collected by a third-party survey company called Responsive Management, and that asks if deer numbers are too low, too high, or just right where residents live. The survey is conducted every 3 years. We just finished the 2023 survey, so that is what you see here. Very similar to what you've seen in previous years, that most of the residents across the state reported that the deer population is just right where they live. Okay, so the next step, I've already gone through those goals and the data that we use. The next step is determine the population objective. That's whether to increase, decrease, or stabilize the deer populations based on the data that I went through. For example, units with CWD or forest impacts will have an objective to decrease the population. Once we determine the objectives for each of our units, the next step is to determine the antlerless harvest target to meet that objective. And that would be either to maintain the current female harvest, or antlerless harvest to stabilize the population, to increase the antlerless harvest to reduce the population, or decrease the antlerless harvest to increase the population. And then the allocation is calculated by taking the antlerless harvest target and multiplying by the number of antlerless licenses it takes to harvest one deer in that unit. And so, for example, if a harvest of 10,000 antlerless deer is keeping a population stable in a unit, and we see from our license sales and harvest that it takes approximately 4 licenses to harvest one antlerless deer, the allocation would be 40,000 licenses to maintain that same 10,000. One thing that I wanted to cover here is we did see a change to the success rates this past year with the new online availability of licenses. We saw an increase in demand and license purchases across the board, and this did lead to a change in that success rate on those licenses. As an example, what that would look like is the harvest target in this example would continue to be the 10,000 antlerless deer. We would just make an adjustment with the updated success rate to allocate 42,000 to continue to maintain that harvest. Okay, so once those calculations are made based on our objectives, we get our antlerless license allocation for each unit. And I apologize, this is a lot here, but we can't really fit all the units and everything in on 2 pages here. So what I'm going to do is kind of break this up. So the first we'll focus on the ones where the objective is to stabilize deer numbers. And basically here the allocation is a level to achieve an antlerless harvest that will continue to maintain or stabilize that population. So continue to take a similar number of antlerless deer in those units to keep those numbers right where they are. You'll notice a few of the units did see a slight increase in allocation, but again, that harvest target is maintained at that level. So that's simply factoring in the updated success rates on those licenses, which decrease in many of the units from that online license sales. Here, units 2A and 2B are the ones that have an increasing population, but the objective is to stabilize. So we made a change the previous year to increase the harvest targets and the allocation to stabilize that population trend. So here the allocation is set to continue that previously increased harvest objective. Units 3D and 2C, here in brown, they have an objective to reduce deer numbers because of forest impacts. 2C also has CWD, which is driving the objective as well. So here we're maintaining the previously increased harvest objectives for both of those units. And now all these units here in orange, all of our CWD units, and I mentioned that 4C was the one that was newly added. This is the only one that's going to get the harvest target increase this year. The rest already had that last year. So this is going to get an increase of 2 antlerless deer per square mile over and above the previous 3-year average antlerless harvest. So the rest of them are essentially continuing the allocation needed to reduce deer numbers. So essentially 4C is the only unit statewide where we made a change to increase the harvest this year. For the rest of the CWD units, we're continuing with the already increased harvest target from last year. But again, once those updated success rates are factored in, it is leading to additional licenses needed to achieve that same harvest target or objective. And we did, I'll note the change in the success rates tends to be something we saw in some of the units that tended to sell out in later rounds. So what we saw was we would sell more of those licenses, especially in those later rounds, but it didn't really mean more deer were taken. So it changes that success rate on those licenses. The other thing here I wanted to highlight are these 3 units. In January, there was a proposal for an extended season and certain CWD units that didn't meet the harvest objectives or were unlikely to meet those harvest objectives, and they tended to not sell out until after over-the-counter sales. So these are essentially those units that were pretty saturated with hunters. We could increase the allocation, but we really didn't expect it to lead to additional deer being taken. It would rather be, 4th, 5th tags in hunters' pockets. And we did see with the online license sales, we did sell more of the licenses in those units. We almost sold out in 4A. So you will be hearing more about this in the next presentation from Andrea Corman, but I did want to mention this here because it does affect the way that we're going to allocate. So in those 3 CWD units, That would be 4A, 4D, and 5A. If the extended season is approved, then the harvest target or objective we feel would be achieved with using last year's allocation because those success rates would increase, providing more time to hunters in those units. Okay, so moving on to the other update. So I wanted to cover a slight change to how we would sell antlerless licenses in the first round this year. And basically, it's a way to alleviate the traffic into the system and the wait times for most hunters. So I'm sure where last year we sold antlerless licenses for the first time online, and we had over 300,000 hunters go into the system on the first few days of license sales, leading to really long wait times and slowness of the system. So the other thing there is a lot of those units that hunters were coming in to purchase on that first day and the first and second and third day were units that were unlikely to sell out in the first round and had historically not sold out until later rounds or even over-the-counter sales. So to help reduce those issues, this year we have identified a way to break up the first round of sales and spread out that demand. So we looked at prior purchasing history along with the allocations that we have this year, and we identified 19 of our 22 wildlife management units. Those are shown here in the white. That we could guarantee the first round resident license for any of those units during that first round of resident sales. So that means there's no need for any hunters that are buying an antlerless license in these units to be there on the first day at 8 a.m. They can take their time, pick a time that works best for them, and that should break up the amount of traffic in the system. So basically that period would run from June 27th to the July 7th, right before the non-resident round starts. Again, they'd be guaranteed for that one antlerless license for the first round. There were 3 units where the allocation and the expected demand this year would still require us to sell them first come, first serve during the first round, and these include units 1B, 2G, and 3A. Those are the ones here highlighted in orange. We anticipate around 95,000 hunters would be vying for these 3 units during that time. So there's certainly still an increased demand and wait time for folks pursuing those 3 units. But to keep that from interfering with all the other sales, we're going to have the sales period start for those 3 units on June 24th. That'd be 3 days prior to the sales period for the rest of the units. And by shutting down sales of all the other unit licenses during the first 3 days, it will greatly reduce traffic and wait times for hunters. Though we'll still be using the QIT software to place hunters in line for those 3 units, and they'll receive they have an option to receive an email alert when it's their turn. After the first round, the rest of the rounds will continue as before with first come, first serve until all licenses are sold. The next step here is we're working to communicate these changes with all hunters. And so we met with our marketing bureau to look at ways to communicate these changes. So they're implementing a campaign to provide multiple touch points to hunters leading up to the beginning of our license sales here. And that concludes the presentation. What I'll do is bring back up the allocation table, and I'm happy to handle any questions. Thank you.
Dave, I have a question. Are you able to go back to one of the earlier slides?
Sure.
I think it may have been slide 3, and this was regarding the kind of public perception of the level of deer throughout the state.
Sure. So our
Let's see. Right, the next one. Nope, 2 more past.
this one?
There. Yeah. So where it says, I guess, across the state, what it's showing, if I'm correct, is most residents say deer population is just right. So in our special reg areas and down in 5C, 5D where I am, where I believe we know that there's an overpopulation. I mean, how is it that, in terms of the survey, residents are saying it's just right in the areas where we have an overpopulation and, large number of roadkills? And I mean, just looking at our roadkill report from 2023, I mean, in the southeast, I think we went from, in 2022, 5,575 to last year, 7,429. So, I mean, I know that has some factors in there, in terms of like demographic shifts and residential and commercial construction and so forth. But I mean, I'm just, struggling to understand if there are residents in that area are saying it's just right. I mean, how do you explain that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. You would think that we would have more residents saying that populations are too high in those areas where we know there are some issues with high deer numbers. The way that we measure this is the most residents. So if you were to look at the proportion of residents that do say it's too high, you definitely see in some of these units like 5C, 5D, and 2B that, upwards of 30% of the public are saying that deer numbers are too high where they live. So, I mean, that is an indication that, there are a lot of folks out there that do believe that. But just the way that we measure that as most is what you see here. In the population report that will come out later, I break it down into a little bit more detail, so you can start to tease some of that out, where you would see, over 25% of folks would say which of the following, and then that gives you a little bit more detail on that.
I mean, even regarding the crop damage issues, I mean, and just asking the farmers, I mean, Alan, I don't want to put you on point, but I mean, as part of that survey, I mean, is this indicating that even our farmers are saying that the population is just right when they may be experiencing increased crop damage?
It really depends on the random sample that this is sent to and the proportion of each of those groups that are part of the population that respond to the survey. I mean, if farmers are making up 10% of the population, they're likely to make up 10% of the respondents in this survey. So that's really, I think it's more of this is a random sample of the residents here in Pennsylvania, and that's what you get from that.
Okay. So I still need to figure that out. I'm struggling with that a little bit.
Oh, go ahead, Haley.
Thank you for your work on the license sales updates. One quick question. You said that hunters will have the ability to be emailed when their turn is up to go ahead and purchase their license. Is it possible to have that text instead of an email, or in addition to an email?
Yes, I actually asked that exact question in a meeting, and right now with our options with the licensing vendor, that is not an option right now. So an email is the best option we have at this time.
Can you go back to this slide with allocations on it?
Sure.
So some of those on there where you have management units where the population objective is to stabilize. The 23-24 allocation is one number, and in some cases it's the same, such as, like 1B, you're not changing, 1A, you're not changing. And then you go down to 2G and you go from 35 to 37. Can you explain that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty simple. It's basically that the harvest target multiplied by the success, the licenses per deer. So if we're seeing a change in the licenses per deer, say it used to take 4.0 licenses and now it takes 4.5, that's going to cause that allocation to increase for that unit. So we look at that unit by unit. So for units 1A and 1B, we didn't see that big of a change in success for those units. We don't tend to see a big change in that measure for units that sell out quickly. You have some of your highest success rates because those are all your first tags. For some of these other units where they're selling out in second or third round, a lot of those sales are now second, third tags that have a much lower chance of being filled than a first tag. And so you tend to see a lower success rate or a higher number for your licenses per deer. And that fluctuate. We saw a bigger change in that last year with the online license sales of, folks buying more of those. And I know personally it was a lot easier to get, once over-the-counter sales came, it was a lot easier to get your tags at that point. You didn't have to go mail anything. You didn't have to go to a county treasurer's office. You could just do it all online. So we did see a big change in license sales probably from that.
Yeah, and I know we had talked previously, and we were kind of looking forward to seeing how that would flesh out right when that came in. So knowing that historically we've been at a 4-to-1 kind of ratio, just so we're all on the same page, those numbers are because you take that generalization down to a more granular detail management unit by management unit.
Yeah, and again, if you look at the population report and allocation summary that we put out later, and you can look at the one from last year, we break down those licenses per deer calculations, and you'll see this year how those have changed. But in some units, it changed a lot more than others, and so that's how we factor in, and that's why you might see, a unit like 5B or 5C have a much different number, because that change would be more drastic.
Okay, thank you.
Along those lines, so 2A and 2B populations increasing, but the allocations are not.
Yes, so if you remember last year, we increased, so you see how over on 4C, we increased the harvest by 2 antlers deer per square mile. 2A and 2B in a previous year, I believe it was last year, we made that change to increase it by 1 antlers deer per square mile above the previous 3-year average. And that was the new harvest target. We're continuing that same harvest target, so we don't need to further increase the allocation. We're still trying to reach that level of harvest to get those populations down. And so the allocation from last year would have that same target as this year, same harvest target. It didn't go up like it did in some of the others because our success rate in those 2 units didn't change that much. So does that answer your question? So
Yes.
we've already turned the knob, and now we're just continuing that.
So the important part of that, to me, was the last part that you said where the success rate did not go up even though the tags allocated did.
Correct. So if we would have seen the success rates change there, you would likely see the allocation go up in those 2 units. Again, the underlying objective didn't change. It's just how many we need to get to that.
Thanks.
Other questions of David? Okay, thank you very much, David.
All right, thank you.
The next item on the agenda is CWD update, options to increased harvest opportunity. Andrea Corman.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon. So I am going to give a brief update on CWD as well as our final recommendations on the extended seasons that were proposed in January. But first, because this comes up quite frequently, I wanted to actually start off with CWD in just a few other states. So Wyoming. While it is not directly comparable to Pennsylvania, I think it's still an important one to talk about because they are observing a 19% annual impact on survival, where 1 out of every 2 deer are infected with CWD. Their research is showing declines in both mule deer and whitetail populations due to CWD. Wisconsin now has more counties that are positive than not. In Iowa and Dane counties, where prevalence is the highest, CWD was around 40 to 50% in adult bucks in 2022. By the end of that season, nearly 11,000 CWD positive deer had been detected in 41 counties since the initial detection in 2002. And in West Virginia, prevalence is around 60% in some areas. And CWD is actually the leading cause of death. Not roadkill, not hunter harvest, CWD. And that county is a top 10 deer harvest county in the state. So hunting and harvesting are still occurring, and yet CWD is still the #1 cause of mortality. And this is what that looks like. So this and the following pictures are from West Virginia. They were kind enough to share them with us, so I could share them with you. One of the does captured was about half of the body weight that she should have been. They have sores on their knees from being unable to stand. And some were so thin that their bones actually wore holes through their skin, which is what you are seeing in this photo. The thing about CWD is that it gives you a false sense of security because you don't see these impacts overnight. But it's been about 12 years and we are seeing them now. So 4A started with just 3 detections in 2012. Now, with sample prevalence around 38%, more than 1 out of every 3 adult deer harvested in that area are positive. If you recall, adult buck sample prevalence in parts of Wisconsin was around 40 to 50%. In our own Bedford County, it is 60%. And while I was putting this presentation together, I stumbled across something that I wanted to share with you from our own response plan. So, to give you a little background, I came to the Game Commission in late 2019. One of my very first tasks was to write the response plan. So, myself and many others were involved in developing this plan, and it was approved in July of 2020. And I took this quote from the plan: that if management strategies are not improved, sample prevalence will continue to increase, likely exceeding 30% in wild deer within Bedford and Blair counties over the next 1 to 2 decades. So the map on the left shows CWD in that area in early 2020, when prevalence was around 8% in Blair and Bedford. The map on the right is CWD today, and those counties are at 32%. This did not take 1 to 2 decades. It only took 4 years. So I hope this illustrates the urgency of doing something to manage this disease. Which brings us to the other part of why I'm here today. So in January, we proposed extended seasons in some CWD units if they did not reach the target harvest and they did reach over-the-counter sales. So now, like David said, we have the harvest data. We were able to evaluate these units and determine which ones would be recommended for this extended season. So starting off with 4C, that one, as David kind of mentioned, is starting with step 1, where we are going to increase the allocation. It had a detection last year, but because of the timing, we were not able to increase the allocation then. So it is starting at step 1 this year. You can see we did meet the target in 2C and 2E, and as this filters through, we are going to recommend extended seasons in 4A, 4D, and 5A. So these are the 3 units where we are recommending the seasons. I think it's important to note that we are only recommending 3 out of the 10, and I think that's a good thing. So with the increased allocations, hunters were able to reach harvest targets in some of the units, and we think with further increasing in allocation, that will help hunters in other units reach the target harvest as well. The recommendation for the season is still the same in terms of antlerless only firearm season. We did do an evaluation to determine when would be the best timing for the season. So we looked at 5 different season options. Any one of these changes will require a floor amendment and a vote from the board. But in terms of the seasons, we looked at a late September, a week in October, a 3-day October that would overlap with the junior-senior rifle season, adding a 3rd week to the current season, and then a January season. So the green highlighting that you're seeing is just kind of showing you what we think is the optimal option for that factor. So for example, total days available to hunt. The late January season had the most days available with 16, and so that would be what we consider the better option. A couple of other factors that I wanted to just point out, we did do a hunter survey, and most of them stated that they did prefer a late post-Christmas season, and more of them specifically stated that they did not prefer an October season. One of the good things about the January season is that we do already have something similar existing in our special regs areas, and we did have kind of a pilot in a DMAP unit in DMA 8 this year, which I'll talk about next. And the last thing is the opportunity to use a replacement tag. So this really applies to most of these seasons. Right now, if you harvest a positive deer, you can get a free replacement tag. However, if you harvest it in rifle season, you're probably not going to get your results back before the end of rifle season. So most of these would help address that issue. But after evaluating all of these factors, our recommendation is for a late January season from the 2nd to the 20th, which would be the Martin Luther King holiday. Now, I mentioned the DMAP unit that we created in DMA 8. This was unique in that an extended season was implemented in this area. The reason being that we talked about earlier was 4C. It had that CWD detection. We typically increase allocations, but because of the timing, allocations were already set. So in order to increase harvest in that area, we created the DMAP unit and implemented the extended season, and that actually mirrored those that are already in place for the special regs areas. Now, a couple of things I just wanted to point out. So first, the regular, antlerless, and flintlock harvests combined, so the green and the orange, changed very little because flintlock declined and rifle increased. The DMAP represented a specific and additional opportunity, and the hunters certainly used it. And there were actually no reported issues as a result of this change, even though it was completely new to that area. And with an extended season, the post-Christmas antlerless harvest nearly doubled over the previous year, and it nearly tripled over the previous 5-year average. So I think the season in that DMAP unit could be considered a success. And I just want to finish by saying that with CWD, we are all faced with making difficult decisions. But CWD is not going away. And the longer we delay in making these difficult decisions, the worse it will get. Our deer herd requires protection from this threat, and I think we can all agree that we do not want to stay where we are now. So thank you, and I can take any questions.
Questions for Andrew?
Andrew, is it possible for us, in terms of how we publicize and define the DMAP areas, to add CWD to that description so that it's clear? I mean, is there any, are there pros, cons? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I don't think there's necessarily any cons. I think that's something I would have to look into because it is part of the already established DMAP program. As far as how we put it on the map, on our CWD interactive map, we probably could, but as far as when people go to actually look up all of the DMAP units in a county, I don't know that I have that ability. I will have to look into that.
Because there's one thing for our hunters to be able to see that in terms of DMAP, but it's another thing. I mean, we obviously don't have the majority of our state residents that hunt, but I think there is a lot of concern amongst non-hunters of CWD. And so if we had a CWD reference as we're, communicating or sharing, at least it gives people the sense that, this is where it is and this is where it was. I mean, I know in the Southeast, in communicating with some of our stakeholders and legislators down there, they're astounded at the growth, and I think are becoming more dialed in and concerned and wanting to help. But I think it would be helpful if we had some way to, better define or add something to that.
Sure.
Andrew,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, could you go back to the DMAP, the DMA 8? Just education for me. So the gray bar was a result of DMAP tags only? Like that antlerless season was only open for DMAP?
No, so the extended season, we did make it where you could use either your unit tag or a DMAP tag.
Okay, that was the
Yes.
clarification. Thank
Yeah.
you.
any other questions?
Andrew, is any consideration given to lifting the restrictions on the agricultural tags? Like right now, you can only hunt like September to a certain date, and then you can't hunt again until later. Why don't we just run ag tag all the way through?
I don't think that would necessarily get us what we need to get with this.
I wouldn't think so.
Yes.
But would it help? I mean, is that something we could add?
I mean, we can look into that and get back to you. Yes.
How, I mean, obviously you talked about it, right?
Right.
So it was insignificant, whatever you came up with.
Yes, and especially for some of the areas that we are talking about, especially 4A, does not have that high a percentage of agriculture to where that would make an impact at the scale that we need to. So I think just with the extended season for antlerless rifle.
So I can assume then that ag tag applications in these areas is rather low.
I don't know that off the top of my head, but I would assume. I don't know that. If you know the answer.
So I looked this up because I believe you asked a similar question at the January meeting.
Okay.
And so I looked at ag tag for the 3 units that we're talking about here. Of the 3, 5A is the one that's the most agricultural and has the highest use of ag tag. There were only 19 farms enrolled in all of the Unit 5A. That accounts for less than 0.5% of the total land in that unit.
Wow.
And
Do you have a number?
so about 3,600 acres with a reported harvest of 40 deer on ag tag in that whole unit. So, I mean, to put in perspective, even if we tripled the amount of ag tag land that enrolled with new enrolls, you would still be looking at 2% of the entire area.
Okay.
And then even if we tripled that ag tag harvest from 40 to 120, we're still looking at fewer than 150 additional deer being taken. So is that helpful? Yeah, an extra 150 deer is helpful. Is it the solution to CWD? I think we can do things that can be more effective than doing that alone, but it certainly would help if we could get more deer taken on that, but I don't want that to substitute for other more
No, I
important
understand. Thank you very much for
Okay.
looking into that. Don't go away from the podium. Bring the one up of all the options. So of all those options, what are your folks' favorite?
That one. The January late season is the one that we would recommend, especially because it has what we consider to be the best options for each factor that we have listed there.
Is that pretty is that recommendation that you have in red, is that pretty close to what the regulations are in special regs areas?
It's a little bit shorter because I know there had been concern about having firearms out in the field beyond what Flintlock currently is. And so we had it kind of coinciding with the end of Flintlock season. But the special regs areas do go to the last Saturday of the month.
So could we move Flintlock season back so we don't short those people? I mean,
So this comes in a week after Flintlock.
this is,
So they still have that whole first week for Flintlock.
so they still have the whole first week
Yes.
Between Christmas and New Year's.
that week. So you said it's a little short. You have a recommendation to making it better?
No, I don't think it's too short. It's just not as long as what is in the special regs area.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you feel pretty confident, at least for now, that that'll get you your goal?
I think so, because our goal right now is to just get to that target harvest, and we're just trying to supplement what we are already getting. And like you can see up there, that's giving people 16 days to hunt, 4 of which are either a Saturday or a holiday. So I think this is an excellent starting point for us to see what that will get us.
85% of the hunters in your survey like that.
They preferred a late season. I think we had two different late season options on the survey. So that's just combining what were the late seasons.
Question, well, I don't know if Commissioner Fredericks is done, but just the question on the late season. I think last meeting I did ask, and Ellen brought it to the attention of the later harvest could potentially impact killing bucks that have lost their horns. So I know, you have it on there, de minimis type thing. However, that's a perception out there. So I know we're only talking about 3 units, but as this spreads statewide and the need for, I hope it's successful, but if not, if it spreads statewide, this is just a 1-year proposal. Correct? You're gonna come back next year. I'm concerned about the buck take in the late season. Perceived. Biologists are laughing at me, but it is a huge perception out there with white-tailed deer hunters that point restrictions are sacred. We've got one of the best states in growing, so perception is reality. So, I'm all for killing more deer. I subscribe to everything you said, just perception. So I just want to put that on the record, that recognizing there's hunters out there who will be nervous, that are supportive of the Game Commission, that will be very nervous of shooting the bucks in that late season that have dropped their horns, and they're more mature bucks, so potentially. So
Right. No, and this
Chris
is
is laughing at me. Yeah, perception, yeah.
Yes, yes. And this is the same as any other time we propose seasons and bag limits. It always changes based on the data that we have.
Right.
So if this is working, we will continue with this. And if it doesn't, then we can also reevaluate.
And I know hunter preference is, later in the season. But if we want to kill more does, and a lot of them, I like the summer months or September. So that's just my opinion. I think you'd kill more of them, which we want to do. So I know when you ask hunters, but if your goal is to kill deer, September and early October are a lot more efficient than the later. So I've heard that from numerous hunters, so thank you. Commissioner Fredericks, did you have more questions? Haley?
I don't have a question. I was just going to encourage you to reconsider the ag tag program extension like Commissioner Fredericks was suggesting, just because we know how CWD is transmitted, and we know that deer love to gather in cornfields, and I think the more we can do to help dissipate that behavior, which would be social distancing, as you put it, the better off we'll be. And if it's only 40 deer, it's still 40 deer, so.
I'm gonna get this straight in my head.
Yep. Yes, yes. Flintlock currently goes until the Martin Luther King. Yes. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
I'm sorry. Blaze orange requirements for the last 2 weeks of Flintlock.
I believe it'll follow the same that we have currently in the special regs areas.
What do they do there? I'm not familiar.
Yeah,
Blaze orange,
Yes.
when Flintlock overlaps,
I believe so.
when the rifles are used.
Just firearms hunters have to be in blaze armor. And that's how it was in DMA 8 then, this year.
And there hasn't been any issues.
From an HRSI standpoint, there has not been.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Andrea? Thank you very much, Andrea.
I would appreciate as insignificant as the ag tag program is, and I understand it is. this thing's going to continue to grow into other units where farming is a big deal. So I would appreciate that if you could find a way to loosen that up too. Let it go, let it rip.
I agree
We
with.
need to kill deer.
Yeah, I think the vast majority or all of us agree with that. So yeah, anything to kill deer and start in July, August with those ag tags, September. It's agricultural driver of Pennsylvania. I agree. Hopefully it doesn't, but if it does expand, yeah, we need to be ready. So yeah.
I mean, the ag tag program, I'm in 2A. We're just overrun with deer. My neighbor has 65 ag tags, and a bunch of us tried as hard as we could to kill as many deer as we could. You know how many we killed? We killed 15 out of 65. So, but I don't know where this is headed. 5 years from now, 6 years, 8 years from now. But we might as well get started and try it. That's how I feel.
Okay.
If you guys choose not to put that in there, that's fine too.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you again, Andrea. Okay, next up on the staff reports is external evaluation of Martin reintroduction in Pennsylvania by Dr. Michael Joyce from the University of Minnesota Duluth. Welcome, Dr. Joyce.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. As you just said, my name is Michael Joyce. I am a wildlife researcher at the University of Minnesota's Natural Resources Research Institute, and I'm really happy for the opportunity to be here today to provide this external evaluation of the current American Martin Reintroduction and Management Plan here in Pennsylvania. I've been studying martins for about 13 years, mostly in Minnesota, but also throughout the Western Great Lakes region and with some collaborations globally. And I do want to make it clear before I get going that I'm here to give you my professional opinion as a martin expert. I do want to make it clear, though, that my opinion does not necessarily represent the opinion of the University of Minnesota as a whole. So I just want to give that caveat up front. In addition to studying martins for 13 years, I was here in 2021 during the field evaluation of martin habitat as part of the feasibility assessment. I have read the feasibility assessment and the management plan, the current reintroduction and management plan. But I do want you to be aware that I was here during that field visit because my opinion is not based just on what I've read in that plan. It's also based on my firsthand observations of the potential release sites. So I'd like to start by just giving a brief overview, couple comments about the plan and the effort. It's a really comprehensive effort. I was really surprised in a good way by how many different factors were considered in that plan and in the feasibility assessment. And when you look at some of the key components of the plan, habitat is key. And that's not just the case with martin, that's true with any reintroduction. It doesn't make sense to bring an animal to an area that they don't exist if there's not a good chance for them to succeed because of existing habitat. It is particularly important for martin because they are somewhat of a habitat specialist, really relying on those old growth characteristics, structural complexity, contiguous forest cover as some of the factors that were identified in the plan and that really meet our current understanding of what martins need on the landscape. I think that the effort undertaken during the feasibility assessment to map habitat suitability was very complete. They took into account all of the factors that I think are really most important in what drives martin habitat suitability, and using that to identify areas and to evaluate on that with those criteria is really important. I'll be honest with you, when I came out in November 2021, I did not expect to see habitat that was as good as what I saw in terms of the structural complexity, particularly at the forest floor. Seeming abundance of tree cavities as we're standing and going to different sites and can see dozens of, what look like suitable tree cavities for martins just from the road. And really just the contiguity of the forest here. I mean, in some areas better than where I'm from in Minnesota, where we have a really healthy martin population. So I think that's key, and I just want to emphasize that I agree with the assessment that the habitat here is adequate for this reintroduction. There's a number of factors that are really important for martins and just in general in terms of the number of animals, the number of source sites, the number of release sites. I appreciate the effort that was taken to consider those, and I think based on the available literature, the current plan really addresses those things really well. And with some of these things I've been saying and what I'll get into a little more for the rest of my presentation, I thought the plan did a really good job of identifying and addressing a whole myriad of different concerns, from logistical concerns, martin biology and ecology, public views on the introduction, and some concerns for factors that could influence the success or not of this sort of a reintroduction. So I know a lot of the current concerns lie in some of these potential factors that could undermine this effort, so I'd like to spend most of the rest of my time giving my opinion on some of those things. The first one is snow, whether there's adequate snow currently, whether you will have adequate snow into the future to support martin populations. And before we get into any of that, I think it's really important to have a firm understanding of why snow is important to martins. And I do want to mention before I forget that snow was actually one of the 5 variables considered for the Habitat Suitability Index, so it is also worked into that habitat suitability model. Snow provides 2 primary functions for martins. One is it serves as a sort of winter blanket, providing warmth thermal cover for martins to rest under the snow, which helps them save energy. And in a few slides, I'll talk a little bit more about what martins might do where they don't have sufficient snow cover when it comes to resting. The other primary function is it's one of several factors that influence the structural complexity and the ability of martins to escape predators when they encounter them. And that's something I'll address in a little bit later. So before we talk about snow and whether this should be a concern or whether this is going to limit the likelihood of success, I think it's important to compare snow in Pennsylvania in the northern tier to other areas that have martins, like northeastern Minnesota. So these are data that my lab pulled together in preparation for this presentation from NOAA. This is average annual snowfall across winters from 2008-2009 to this winter. We just had a big 2.5-foot snowfall a few weeks ago. It's incorporated in here. And what you see is, yes, as some concerns have been brought up, the northern tier of Pennsylvania does have, on average, less snow than other areas where martins are currently established. But one thing that I think is critical is that the amount of snow that is in that tier is sufficient to provide this warm and insulating effect for martins if there's areas for them to go and rest on the ground level. It is also really important to note that snowfall has been in the past, and will continue to be quite variable from year to year. So last year we had a record snowfall where I live. This year we had barely any snow. We still have martins surviving through that. When you look at this period that we summarize, these 16 years, about 1/3 of them included years like this, 2020 to 2021, when the northern tier of Pennsylvania had as much, or in some years more, snow than we got in northeastern Minnesota, in northern Wisconsin, and in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, which all currently support martin populations. So there is potential, even if it's variable, that snow is and will continue to support martins. How will martins respond to loss of snow? I think we all agree that we don't know exactly what the weather is going to be like in a week, and projections what the snow is going to be like in 50 to 100 years is tenuous at best. We know to expect differences. We know that there's a range of possible scenarios, but what happens if you reintroduce martins, they establish, and then you lose snow? This is actually pretty well established in literature. Some of the work that I did as a graduate student and an unpublished paper that we're working on right now. When it comes to winter rest sites, as you go from areas with really deep and persistent winter snow to areas that have variable or no snow cover, martins switch their resting sites from being on the ground under the snow to using tree cavities. And some recent work we've done in Michigan and in Minnesota shows that when they make this switch, there isn't actually an energetic cost to it. So as things warm and snow is less predictable, they actually don't have a high energetic cost of making this switch. In Minnesota, where it gets really, really cold, they do have an energetic cost. But in areas along the southern range boundary, it's not as big of a deal. And in fact, in Michigan, the northern lower peninsula, they have adequate snow to serve as insulation, and they're still using tree cavities. And so with the assessment and the availability of cavities, I think that the concern over loss of snow and what that might mean to marten with respect to winter resting is probably overstated and is not quite as important as some people have made it out to be. The other thing I want to say before I go on is we also found in that study that we'll be submitting for publication in a few months here that where snow is not present, the ground can also serve as insulation. And so where they have burrows, they're also able to rest on the ground in the absence of snow and still have thermal protection. What about marten-predator interaction? So this is the other part of snow, but it's also just a larger concern. I think it's important to start from an understanding of how small martens are. They're 1 to 2 pounds, maybe a little bit bigger. They look bigger than they are because they're long and skinny and because their hair adds a lot of volume. There is not a marten population in North America or anywhere that is not susceptible to predation by predators because of their size and because of the presence of larger predators. And so it's not really a question of will predators kill martens if you reintroduce them. That is a characteristic of every marten population. It's the expectation that that will happen. The question really is, will it happen at a level that will prevent martens to reestablish? This is a picture from my graduate work of a marten that was killed by a predator in Minnesota. One of the things we know, and again, snow is one but not the only component of structural complexity, is that this structural complexity that martens need and that is present and quite abundant in Pennsylvania provides them protection from these interactions with predators. So thick, dense vegetation on the ground, large trees with cavities that they can go into and predators can't access. Those are all things that helps them in their strategy to avoid predators. In Minnesota, where I work and live, predation is a really important source of mortality for our marten population. It's just behind harvest. We trap martens there in terms of annual mortality source. And so one of the things I was interested in as a PhD student was, where are these interactions happening? Are they happening in really good marten habitat, or are they happening in areas that martens have to go through as they move through a fragmented landscape, but not areas that they really want to be? And it's not happening in their primary high quality habitat. They're getting killed by predators on the edges of forests, in open areas and areas lacking canopy cover. And so that's just to say that you should expect that if this reintroduction goes forward, that martens will be killed by predators. It's a good concern to bring up, and it's something that should be monitored if this goes forward. But it's the expectation, and the habitat suitability overall should buffer this effect and not prevent martens from reestablishing, despite good populations of fishers and bobcats and coyotes here. And finally, no introduction or no predator population can ever be considered without potential effects to prey populations, whether those be rare species or whether those be species of management concern. The marten is a very diverse predator. It eats a lot of different prey. They're what we call facultative generalists, and so what they eat is generally dictated by what is available. And so when you think about things like northern flying squirrels, Allegheny wood rats that are rare on the landscape, they're not going to go and eat the rare things. They're going to eat the things that are abundant. It's not to say that they might not eat some of those, but it's unlikely that they're going to have substantial effects on those populations because they're not going to go seek out the rarest thing on the landscape. Diet is a really well-studied aspect of marten ecology across their range. And to the concern of turkey predation, there is not a study that has documented predation of turkeys or their eggs by martens, despite some of our ongoing diet work in areas where turkeys are very prevalent. And so that is really scientifically not a founded concern. It's not something that I would be worried about. Grouse is another one where martens do eat grouse, and if they're introduced, it is possible that they, and perhaps even likely that they will eat some grouse in Pennsylvania. But as the reintroduction plan stated with their review and my review as my time as a researcher on martens of many more papers, it doesn't end up being a very frequent part of their diet, so they'll eat it, but usually at really low frequency. In Minnesota and Michigan, where we're working on some diet work with martens right now, We harvest somewhere around 1/4 to 500,000 grouse a year, so we have really, really good grouse populations, and we're not detecting grouse predation very frequently. Certainly less than 5% of our samples have grouse in them. So again, I think this is something that is a really important consideration. I appreciate the concerns and the effort that the plan took in considering this, but I don't see this as being a huge, I would not see this as being a huge hurdle to jump over. I do think it's important to monitor what they're eating, whether it's for evaluating these impacts, but also just to see what they're eating and providing good data for management. So just to kind of conclude, you know, it is my opinion that this reintroduction and management plan is very detailed, thorough, comprehensive. It's very well done. The plan, to me, adequately addresses a lot of really all of the concerns and potential concerns and factors that were brought up. As a marten expert, I don't see factors that are missing from this plan. And I do believe that this plan has a very high likelihood of success if you were to implement it. And with that, I'd gladly take any questions you have.
I have a few questions, Michael. First of all, thank you so much for coming here and talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Of course.
My first question is, were martens extirpated in Minnesota and then reintroduced, or have they always just been there?
That's a really good question. So martens were extirpated or nearly extirpated. They're considered extirpated, but there were areas that humans didn't really get into that probably held martens. In the Western Great Lakes region, we're actually the only state that did not reintroduce martens, so they came back naturally from some of these remnant populations. We also are connected to Ontario and Manitoba, and so they were able to move back in from there. Similar factors to what happened in Pennsylvania in terms of unregulated harvest and forest change.
My second question, and one of our big concerns is, in Minnesota, has there been any incidents or problems with predation by martens on farm animals, like specifically chickens or perhaps rabbits that are raised for food, anything like that?
No, and for American martens and the other species we have in North America, Pacific martens, I am not aware of any diet studies ever published showing that happening anywhere. It is something that happens with European pine martens, but they live a lot closer to humans, typically.
So there have been no complaints in Minnesota of any martens ever eating any farm animals?
There have been no documented cases of martens eating farm animals. A lot of, like chickens is one, ducks, geese. Most of the complaints that we get relate to bobcats, small weasels, foxes, mink.
And did I hear you correctly? Did you say that they do not eat wild turkey eggs?
I'm not aware of any evidence in the diet studies that I've read that would, that's not been documented.
They've not eaten turkey eggs? Oh.
Correct.
And one last thing, what about rabbits? Are they able to catch like snowshoe rabbits?
They can, yes. But like grouse, it does make up some of their diet. In Minnesota, where we have robust snowshoe hare populations, we see it happen, but it's not a major part of their diet.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a couple questions. What other kind of predator can catch one of them things? Coyote, bobcat? Is that what, I mean?
Yeah, so the main predators across the range are coyotes, bobcats. We've had some wolves and some Canada lynx kill them in Minnesota. Goshawks, great horned owls. Fishers will do it sometimes.
Oh, yeah. How sensitive are they to staying within the very desirable habitat that they need? Because in Pennsylvania, I believe we're talking about just a small area up in northwestern Pennsylvania that's, apparently, according to you, very suitable to them. Are they gonna have a drive to disperse out of that area, or?
I think the big drive to disperse, so with martens and specifically with reintroduction, I'll have to apologize for anthropomorphizing a little, but if I were plucked out of my home and dropped somewhere I wasn't familiar with, I'm going to move around for a little bit and try to find what's going on and where I need to settle, especially if you take my cell phone. So when we're talking about a reintroduction, that sort of dispersal and searching is expected. And it may take days to months for them to find and settle into an area. Some of that is getting familiar with prey resources. Other resources they're looking for, learning what new threats or different places that threats occur to them. And so there's gonna be some movement during that time. From the studies that I've reviewed, we're talking about in the order of typically single kilometers to tens of kilometers, not very far.
Okay.
The other dispersal event happens when young are produced, they disperse from the territory. And occasionally, we haven't seen this much, but we have occasionally see adults, something changes, maybe there's a bobcat active and they don't want to stay there and they might disperse as adults. But they have the capability to go a great distance where there's connectivity. And so if there's areas like around the release sites where there's not suitable habitat, that is likely to effectively constrain them to those areas compared to something like a fisher, a bobcat, larger predators that can move through unsuitable areas better than martins can.
That's what I was driving at. It sounds to me like from your presentation, chances are pretty high if they try, for whatever reason, to disperse out of that area that we're talking about, they're probably not going to fare well.
Yeah, they're going to hit areas that they don't want to be in, and they're going to stop, turn around, and
Go
try to
back.
find a better option.
And as opposed to, a lot of our citizens are concerned that they're going to see the same thing that they saw with fishers, which bigger, more able to survive, not confined to a real specific.
And more able to go through landscapes that they can't settle in while they're moving. And we study fishers as well in Minnesota, and it's the same thing we see there with them moving into agricultural dominated areas, and they are able to move across those gaps
Right.
much more than I would even expect sometimes, honestly.
So if I understand you correctly, their habitats is very specific and very limiting to them.
Yeah, it can be.
Okay.
Yes.
Chances are they're gonna stay in that area that you
Yeah.
all have identified as a.
Yeah, and I mean, an anecdote that I think helps illustrate that is even in Minnesota, where there's good habitat surrounded by a 40 to 60 acre clear cut, they're not going across the center of that. They're going to go around the edge. They might cut a corner. We all get lazy sometimes, but yeah, they don't like to move through areas where they're vulnerable, and areas without overhead cover, they're very vulnerable to raptors and other predators.
Yeah, they're not gonna move out across open farm country.
No.
So do you foresee in the proposed reintroduction areas that they are large enough in size to sustain a marten population where trappers would have an opportunity in the future to go in and?
I believe so. Yep. And I think the plan does a good job of estimating with sort of an average home range size what you could expect in terms of potential habitat population size. It may be slightly more than that, because if the habitat is really good quality and there's really good prey, they'll have smaller territories. It may be slightly smaller than that, because where they overlap with predators, their populations aren't at their maximum potential density. But yeah, I believe that's true.
Michael, from the question that Commissioner Fredericks had on the dispersal, so, I mean, the drop sites, northwestern PA, so Tioga County, that type of thing. So in my mind, you said the snow doesn't impact, but you surveyed the land, there's a lot of good poles and trees or den trees, and I agree with you. So the dispersal, when you say don't go across a clear cut, well, okay, well, they're clear cut in Pennsylvania is 50, 60, 100 acres, but all of 2G and 2F is all den trees. I mean, essentially pole timber and not big clear cuts. So could you conceivably see we drop them in a site and all of central Pennsylvania becomes marten habitat?
Can you repeat the question?
So with the proper denning trees and cover, which is, you described an area, it's all, I live in central, so it's all central, it's predator central already because of the good den trees and trees in general. So the dispersal of martens, although it may not go to southeastern Pennsylvania or where we're sitting here, the entire central Pennsylvania is marten territory.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they could effectively move throughout that area.
Correct.
They can move long distances.
Yeah,
We're
I
good
get that.
habitat.
They're not going to go and set up shop in Indiana, Pennsylvania, or here. But we're talking the entire central PA as martin habitat.
I think if you, yeah, and I
If you
don't
shave
know.
off, I know you're not from here. If you shave
Yeah.
off Erie County at 79 and shave off 80, well,
Yeah.
Poconos is good habitat, but
And so if I could say it this way,
Roll
the,
it 50 years.
the five primary targeted release sites plus the 2 auxiliary release sites within that area, there are some areas in there that they might not be able to move, but each of those segments represents a good chunk of habitat
right,
for them to live.
thank you.
In your home state, Minnesota, you mentioned northeast when you were talking about snow. Is there a significant population of pine martens south of there? Are they all,
It has moved around over time. It's gotten a little bit farther south. We've actually spread into Wisconsin a little bit. We've had fishers and bobcats sort of change where they're at year to year. But yeah, it goes, that's the core habitat in Minnesota is sort of the northeastern part, but they do go
northeast,
outside of
that's
that
the
area.
core.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time hunting grouse up there, and I never saw one.
They're good at not being seen, that's for sure. Sometimes even when they're wearing a radio collar.
I have a question. Have you ever, I guess in your research, experienced any situations where humans have moved the martens to another area?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Yep. I think a bigger issue when it comes to people doing things they shouldn't be doing is poaching. We don't have a big problem with that, but occasionally someone will get busted who's running a really long trap line and killing a lot of animals indiscriminately. But I'm not aware of any situations of them being trapped and moved somewhere else.
Other questions for Dr. Joyce?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Michael, thank you very much for coming in. We appreciate it. Pennsylvania here, we don't have very much snow and haven't had the past several years. I think we might have had a foot up in the Allegheny area that lasted about a week. And one thing we do have is an abundance of predators, and fishers are a part of that. And everything that I've read about, and you concurred today, and Tom also included that in his report, that snowpack is very important because the marten needs its subnivean climate, not only for thermal protection, but also for protection from the predators. And I saw an article, Vermont reintroduced martens back in 1989 in the southern part of Vermont. And they also put trail cameras out at that time. And each night they would view these trail cameras, they were seeing a ton of fishers that had converged on this area and only a few martens. And as time went on, eventually they didn't see any martens. And what they learned later on, because they had these animals tagged, that the martens were leaving the area. They were finding them as far away as 150 miles. So my concern is to reintroduce an animal like that and bring them into Pennsylvania where they don't have, and I know you talked about the cavities in the trees, and I know that's pretty good up there, but they still got to go out and forage, and they still got to go out and hunt. I guess I'm kind of concerned about how they're going to take. I don't want to see what happened in Vermont where these critters leave town and start heading up towards the Adirondacks, which is probably the greatest amount of snow cover that we have here on the east. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
You're not wrong.
I also looked into Michigan on the southern part of the Upper Peninsula, and they were having pretty much the same kind of problem, and also with fishers, which that surprised me because they're somewhat cousins as weasels. But I guess because they are competitors for the same foods, that probably has something to do with it. But again, with all the predators that we have here in Pennsylvania, do you really think that these guys can make it as far as a reintroduction?
I do, and I would like to first correct the studies that have been done in the UP of Michigan with martens and fishers have actually found really high rates of co-occurrence. They haven't found exclusion of martins by fishers. So I'm not sure what article you're reading about that.
I have it in my room. I will bring it in later on, because I received that from the biologist
Okay.
from Michigan. Now, to go back to Vermont, they considered their reintroduction a failure, but as later years went on, they found out that marten on the eastern side of the state had colonized and were somewhat prospering. But the report that came from that was that those martens had already been there. They weren't the animals that were reintroduced.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that you brought up is the idea that they might leave because of predator density and they might seek out the Adirondacks as an example. If that was a distance or a suitable habitat for them to traverse, we might expect that they will come the other way, which we haven't seen. So I think that moving around, finding the place to exist within a landscape of other predators is something that martens naturally do. It's something that they've evolved doing for millions of years. And what we see in our study area where we've collared martens, fishers, and bobcats, in Minnesota, fishers are not a very meaningful predator on martens. They kill them occasionally. Bobcats seem to be the main predator that we're worried about. I know you also have a healthy bobcat population here. What we see is that where they overlap in space, martens spend more of their time, and they do occasionally go to the same spot, but they tend to spend more of their time in areas that the predators that could kill them are not spending time. There has been recent work from Minnesota and Wisconsin showing that martens can outcompete larger predators for prey, and so that's one way that they're able to carve out this living and successfully live, reproduce, and I mean, even in cases sometimes where there's high predation rates, still persist in those landscapes. And so it's with consideration of all these factors that I do expect that predators are going to kill martens in Pennsylvania if you go forward. I think that enough habitat features like the ones you mentioned and I mentioned earlier are present, and you know, bobcats and fishers are generally focusing, they all eat a range of the same prey, but bobcats and fishers tend to eat larger prey than martens, and so I think there is space in terms of competition for prey for them to exist, have the prey resources they need, have the habitat features that allow them to avoid and escape predators where they encounter them. Not every time, but enough of the time that I think it's an important consideration. I appreciate your thoughts and comments on it and questions. But it is my opinion that there's enough good habitat here that would not limit the reintroduction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's their reproduction rate? What normal, what do you call it, a litter?
Litter, yep, and kits are the young. So they, like other weasels, they don't have a very high reproductive rate, so they have a single litter a year, and they can produce between 1 and 5 kits in that litter. We've seen in Minnesota that they typically produce around 2.7 on average, so a lot of 2s and 3s. We've seen litters of 4 there as well. But it's going to vary year to year. So some of the prey they eat have natural population cycles. In a year, we just saw this in Minnesota, in a year where you have really good small mammal abundance, we see a lot more reproduction. When we're out trapping, we see a lot more juveniles the next year that have survived through. And so it will fluctuate over time.
Well, quality of habitat dependent?
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Thank you, Michael. That was very informative. Thanks for making the trip. We sincerely appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next on the agenda is Tom Keller, update on the marten reintroduction. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, well, good
Yeah,
afternoon.
let's say, Tom,
Yep.
we need a bathroom break for 5 minutes.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, we walked around and got some blood flowing and all ready, all attuned to Tom. So Tom,
All
please
right.
proceed.
Well, good afternoon, commissioners. Good afternoon, executive staff. It's my privilege to get to provide you with a project update on the American Martin reintroduction in Pennsylvania. And so what we've done since the January meeting was start to develop some charges to kind of work on based on what we heard from commissioners at that meeting and then since that meeting, things to help answer some of your questions, concerns, or your comments. The first of those was really to conduct follow-up surveys of those hunters that were in support to understand why they were supportive, as well as those that were neutral to understand why they were neutral. The second was really to find, is there additional support from organizations out there within the state, particularly sportsmen's organizations? The third was to complete additional education opportunities as they came about, and thanks to many of you board members, they did come about and I was able to take advantage of those. And lastly was to address habitat and climate concerns through external evaluation, which is what we were fortunate to have Dr. Joyce join us for here previously. So the first thing we did was we resurveyed those hunters that were supportive of Martin reintroduction to understand why they were supportive. And when we asked that question, really it was clear that most of them were supportive to restore a native species to Pennsylvania, followed by restoring ecological community, and then things like biodiversity and legacy, even trapping. And then we asked them, would you like to learn more? And if you would, how would you like to learn more? And it was very clear that most would like a video, a lot would like a pamphlet, and then a lot would also like to hear more on social media. And then we asked those hunters that were neutral why they were neutral. And we found that 70% of those hunters said they just didn't know enough about the issue. And then about 17% said that they just didn't care. And then we had others within that mix as well. We asked them if they would like to learn more, and those that indicated they would like to learn more, very similarly, would like a video, a pamphlet, or social media. Now we should pause here to talk a little bit about those available resources that we've had for the last several years. We've actually had 3 videos available through YouTube, our website, sent out through social media, one on the plan, one on the assessment, and one summary video. We've also have a 3-fold brochure. We printed over 10,000 of those and handed those out throughout the state, as well as a digital copy that we've provided on our website. And then we have 5 other single-page handouts on the project as well that we printed and provided digitally. And then, of course, through social media, working with marketing, working with I&E, we've been able to get a lot of good social media posts out, including things like this Facebook Live event where we could talk about it and answer questions from the public live. But we did ask that question, do you want to learn more? And what was really interesting was a lot of the supportive folks did want to learn more, but close to a third of the neutral hunters said they did not want to learn more, which is interesting in comparison to that 70% that said they didn't know enough. Now, as far as putting this in perspective, that's about 22% of our hunters, and that's about 1.4% of all Pennsylvanians. Now, as far as the additional education opportunities that we've completed since January, we've done 13 additional presentations, and that brings us to a total of 105 presentations throughout the state of Pennsylvania, reaching close to 7,000 people in person. We've conducted 32 interviews within the last several years for popular media. 9 articles have been written by ourselves to send out to popular media. We've done 8 podcasts, both internal and external. And then, of course, 8 social media postings, working very closely with Bureau of Marketing. And as far as additional organizations, since the January meeting, we've had 9 additional organizations pledge their support with a letter of support. 6 of those were sportsmen's groups, and I actually just received number 7 today, right before I walked up here. So that brings us to 30 organizations that have provided a letter of support for this project and that stand behind us. Staff have completed the reintroduction assessment process. We've developed clear feasibility with the feasibility assessment that was completed in 2022. We have very powerful justification through a variety of different categories. We've used science-based planning to develop this 10-year reintroduction and management plan. We've used expert collaborative review through steering committees and working groups, as well as sending this out to over 65 different organizations across North America for review. We've done a comprehensive communication, which we talked about previously, and we have very strong partner support with over 30 organizations standing behind us to help push this forward. And finally, we have overwhelming public support. 92% of Pennsylvanians support this, and the majority of hunters support it as well. So with that, I'm asking the board to accept the management plan for the reintroduction of the American marten and bring this species back to Pennsylvania. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns that I can address at this time?
Comment. Thank you for what you've done, and also I know you've talked to several people last week on my behalf, and one of them is polite to say neutral, maybe slightly negative, and
Sure.
Your presentation was his comment to your professionalism and what he learned from you were unbelievable. So thank you for all you do and your persistence and what you've done to bring this forward. So
Thanks, Commissioner.
is questions for
Tom, it's pretty clear from your presentation here that people still want information.
Sure.
My question to you is, do you feel that you have the resources that you need to get more information out, for example, a video? I mean, there's like a big demand for a video.
Yeah. Well, we have 3 videos out. We've had them out
you
for a
do?
long time.
And
Yeah.
how do you disperse them? How do you?
Well, so we've used social media quite a bit to try to get that out to folks. And then, of course, all of that is linked on our pamphlets, on our handouts. We have a story map where we have those linked to. So we've tried to use every available resource that we can
But
to
when
get
those,
that information
when those,
out.
that whole gang of people, when they say they'd like to see a video,
Right.
are they the kind of people that are going to go on to YouTube or go to the PGC website and look for that, or is
Right.
is there another method? And do you have the resources and the ability to get them out?
I think we do. I mean, certainly partnering within our bureaus here, I do feel like we've done a pretty good job at that, trying to get that information out there. And again, it's important to understand that it is a fairly small percentage overall of like who we're talking about, but it's also really good information for us for the future. And when we look at this plan, a big part of this plan is communications and strategy and communications. And this plan is very flexible, and that we designed it that way so that when we get information like this, if we want to do more videos, if we want to do more social media promotion, if it's approved, that will be the best way for us to get this information out. And so I think we can make those adjustments to the plan and say, hey, this is how people want to learn about it, and this is how, moving forward, we need to do that.
How hard would it be for you to bring that slide back up?
Not hard at all.
You have to admit that's a cute critter. That one.
Whoops.
That one?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that's still, I mean, you don't have percentages on there, but that's still a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
that want to know more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and I think if we decide to move this forward, that will be a major part. Again, that is a major part of the plan, and we can start to adjust that plan to utilize these specific ways.
I mean, my personal observation is you've gone overboard with getting out to the public and making I mean, but what else are you supposed to do? But
And we know we'll never reach everyone. And personally, I would love to talk to every Pennsylvanian about this,
Yeah.
because I feel like if I can get in front of them and present this information, I may not change their mind, but as long as people feel informed, they can still oppose it, and that's perfectly fine. I just want people to feel informed.
you know what? You're right. Yeah.
So that's my hope, is if we decide to move this forward, this is not going to stop. Now, I can unlikely do another 105 presentations, but I think that there's a way that we can, obviously that's not as important to people. This is what's important. So then we shift our focus. We have a lot of these tools ready, maybe we just need to try to figure out better ways to get them out there. But we do not stop. We don't let off the gas as far as communication goes. You've got to keep moving that the whole way through the project, and that's a big important part of kind of what we've laid out within the plan.
Made me very, very happy to hear that. Thank you.
I'm glad. Yep.
Tom, have you talked to any representatives of the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau?
Yeah. So I actually sat down, it's probably been close to a year, but with the president and one of his staff, just kind of cold contacted them because I figured that may be something they're concerned about. And we've seen in some articles where farmers have concerns. And so I went in and sat down, kind of went over my presentation with them. It was a very positive experience, at least speaking with him, but yeah, so we have sat down with them and answered their questions and concerns and tried to address all those.
Did they give you any indication as to how they felt?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of started that conversation with what are your primary concerns, and it wasn't any surprise. We knew that folks are concerned, especially from the agricultural community, primarily about poultry, and so we sat down with them, kind of felt that out, and then we got into talking about what we've seen in the science, which, as Dr. Joyce mentioned, there's really no evidence out there that this is an impact, and also talking to them about where marten would be reintroduced versus where primarily our agricultural areas are and our poultry farms are, which is likely mostly down along the southern tier, but in our ag areas. And as Dr. Joyce pointed out, and as we have in the plan, when we think about marten habitat, it's very specific to that structural complexity forest habitat, which is really not where we have our big agricultural areas.
So did they give you any indication as to whether or not they were for or against the reintroduction?
They did not, but they said they were going to take the information that I provided back to their board, and then hopefully their general membership. So.
And that was a year ago?
It was probably a year ago.
But you have not heard back from them then?
No, and I can get you the exact date on when we sat down and talked with them.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Tom, can you go back to the slide that shows I remember you saying 92% of the population supports it and the majority of the hunters support it? Is that
Yeah.
the bar
That was
graph?
just the last slide. So that's just the last point there I had. I didn't really have a graph per se.
When you go back to the bar graph, though, that 1%.
Yes.
Can you just revisit that for me, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep. So when we asked, do you want to learn more?
When you asked the hunters
Yes.
who were neutral or hunters in general?
So hunters that were neutral. So
Okay.
these were just follow-up surveys. We did a separate survey, one for those in support that said they were in support from that original survey that was conducted by I&E. So we followed up with the supportive hunters, and then we followed up with the neutral hunters separately. And we asked them basically 3 questions. One was, I'll just go back. Why are you neutral, or why are you in support?
And the overall percentage that were neutral from hunters was 30%, right? It was 30, 30, 30.
So it's 31% neutral.
Okay.
It's 32% opposed and 37% in support.
Okay, thank you.
So that's a majority, but then also if you look at this, you have 17% of those neutral that state they don't care. So then that jumps you to 53% of hunters that are either in support or just don't care.
Neutral, okay.
And then what was interesting is this I don't know enough. What I found interesting is when we asked that, 70% said I don't know enough. And then we asked the question, do you want to know more?
Right.
And then a third of them said no, which is interesting too. And I don't know what that means. I don't want to jump into that, but.
Well, and
yeah.
just to clarify, this is 70% of that 30%. So it's actually
31%.
Yeah, you're
That's correct. Yeah.
you're-
Yeah, and that's why I thought it was important when we look at that bar graph, just to talk about, when we talk about hunters, the ones that do want to learn more, 22% of hunters that were neutral do want to learn more. So certainly folks that we should target. And then
But that's
when we
only one-
think about total statewide, that's only 1.4% of the population. Just to give us perspective on how many folks we're talking about.
Other questions of Tom? Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, next up, we have the Rough Grouse and American Woodcock Program update by Raina Tao.
Hello. Thank you for having me here to talk to you all today. So my name is Raina Tile. I'm the Grouse and Woodcock biologist for the Game Commission. I've been in this role for a couple months shy of 2 years, and this is actually my first presentation to all of you, so I wanted to provide a little bit of background about myself. Prior to joining the Game Commission, I worked in Missouri as their wild turkey and ruffed grouse biologist out there, where we were actively working to restore ruffed grouse into the state of Missouri. Did that job for 3 years. Prior to that, I was at West Virginia University studying wild turkeys out in South Dakota. So anyways, have kind of a broad variety of game bird experiences from across the country. Happy to be here in the Keystone State. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of our ruffed grouse and woodcock population status here in the Commonwealth. One of the main indices that we use to monitor our grouse population is through information provided by dedicated grouse hunters during our hunting season. So they will report to us the number of hours that they spend afield and the number of grouse that they encounter while hunting, also the number of grouse they harvest and some other metrics. And we can use that to calculate the number of grouse that they flush per hour afield. And so as you may remember, in 2017 and 2018, we had some pretty severe West Nile virus disease years, and we saw our grouse population respond by having our record low flush rate there, as well as some low productivity metrics. The good news is, though, since we hit that low point, we've been slowly ticking upwards. And this last season, this last fall, during the 2023-2024 ruffed grouse hunting season, our flush rate at the statewide scale was 1.07. Which was our highest flush rate index in the last 10 years. So that's still lower than where we were in the late 2000s, the early 2010s, probably not, where we really want to be, but it's nice to see that we are trending back in a positive direction. Another thing that we did to help our grouse population is that when we did see that crash after those severe West Nile virus years, we responded by making some changes to our hunting regulations. So we introduced the responsive harvest framework that has resulted in our late season, our post-Christmas grouse hunting season, being closed since 2017. When we did that, when we made that change, we wanted to try to evaluate if that was having any sort of effect on our grouse population. And so since then, we've been looking at our Pennsylvania North Zone. So this is our WMUs that are north of I-80, and comparing the flush rate that we see there with the flush rate observed in southern New York, which borders that region. So New York still has a late grouse hunting season. They hunt through the end of February. And so as you can see, these indices, the flush rate in southern New York and northern Pennsylvania tracked each other pretty well for a while. And then we made that change and those trends started to diverge. So New York's grouse flush rate kind of continued to decline a little bit, in a sense stabilized, maybe, is on the up and up. But our northern Pennsylvania flush rate kind of responded by starting to increase in recent seasons. And so it's hard to say whether the trend that we're seeing, that divergence and the response up north, is completely due to that change. There's probably other factors involved, but it is positive to see that there is potential that closing that late season is having a positive effect on our grouse. Another index that we use to monitor our grouse here in Pennsylvania is our summer sighting survey. So Game Commission staff, as they're going about their daily activities out in the field during June, July, and August, they record the number of days that they're spending out in the field and the number of grouse and types of grouse that they're seeing. So they'll record hens with broods, they'll record just individuals that they see, and by calculating the number of grouse that they observe per day, we can get an idea of how production was that summer. So in theory, if there's a good hatch, there will be a lot more grouse out running around. Our staff will encounter more grouse per day. And then the other side, where if there's fewer grouse because of a bad hatch, they won't encounter as many. This is something that's kind of interesting. We've been seeing that, not really respond positively. We've been seeing continued poor production in recent years. When we take a look at both indices together, we kind of noticed that they're also starting to diverge. So they used to track each other pretty well, which makes sense. Grouse populations are driven by production. So when we have a good hatch, we see a corresponding, population increase. We expect to see hunters encountering more grouse during the following fall season. And when there's a poor hatch, again, we see the population respond with lower abundance. And so we are seeing, the grouse population seems to be rebounding based on what we're seeing with our hunter flush rate, but our production metrics are remaining low. So the fact that those are disjointed is kind of interesting. We're trying to get to the bottom of what might be going on there, just to make sure that if we're managing our population using this data, that it's good data that's capturing reality. Shifting gears to woodcock. So the main index that's used to monitor woodcock across their range in North America is coordinated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's the Federal Singing Ground Survey. Pennsylvania is in the eastern region and within the breeding range of woodcock, so we participate in that. Surveyors go out and count woodcock along designated routes year to year, and then they can look at the number of males that they hear singing during the springtime along those routes through time. And what we've seen recently in Pennsylvania is, I guess, another little bit of good news. So we've been seeing a non-significant increasing trend over the last decade in our woodcock numbers, our breeding woodcock numbers. So it's good news because it means that they're not, declining anymore like they had been for a while. But again, maybe we're not quite where we'd like to see woodcock. There's still work to do as far as improving habitats for woodcock in the state and hopefully seeing those numbers tick up even more. Like we do with our grouse hunters, our woodcock hunters during the fall season will record hours spent hunting woodcock and the number that they're observing. As you can see, the number of woodcock flush per hour hunted is a lot more variable than, has been quite variable in recent years, but in general is fairly stable. When we look at the last 10 years of flush rate data and take the average, this past hunting season was sitting above that 10-year average. And so woodcock have been pretty heavily studied in the eastern region in recent years. So the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Cooperative based out of Maine has been tagging woodcock in the spring or during the summer prior to their fall migration, and then also during the winter prior to their spring migration, and studying different aspects of that. And one cool finding from that study, they looked at peak migration stopover visits in different states along the eastern range. And we found that Pennsylvania, or I guess migratory woodcock, are stopping over in Pennsylvania the most during late October and early November, which is exactly when our season is open, which is what you would hope for. So basically we're providing that hunting opportunity during the exact right time for hunters to take advantage of those woodcock being here in the state. And then another cool finding that they've had recently, so that singing ground survey that we use to monitor woodcock across their range, one of the really important assumptions of that survey is that we're not double counting males as they migrate through the continent. And so your hope is that you don't start surveying until woodcock have settled into their breeding areas and migration has concluded. And they did find that. So throughout most of the breeding range of woodcock, males have settled into the area that they're going to spend their spring and summer before we start surveying, which the survey period opens up on Monday. And another thing that they found is that the singing ground survey extent, so the area that we're surveying across North America, covers 90% of the breeding male woodcock range from tagged individuals that they were able to track. So it's good news that the survey that we use to monitor this species is capturing what we hope it is. And that was a really quick presentation and update for you guys. Let me know if you have any questions.
I have a question. Can you go back one slide? So I was oblivious to the woodcock most of my life, and I'm fascinated by them now. But I'm just curious. It seems like is it Ohio and the Midwestern states are just not participating in this, or?
So there has been some expansion into the central region, which is more of what those states are in. So most of the banding has occurred within eastern region states, but I think last winter they did band birds in Louisiana, and they're tracking their flight paths through migration now. So we will probably learn a little bit more about woodcock in the central region as this study moves forward.
Thank you.
Raina, on a presentation maybe a couple years ago, prior to you, it's a West Nile virus, right, that affects the grouse, that populations were high in the northern central counties because there weren't mosquitoes. When the population is increasing, are they reestablishing outside of those higher altitude areas?
Yeah, a little bit. So we monitor woodcock through a couple of different things. We've had a study recently where they've put ARUs out in grouse, in suitable habitat for grouse in varying levels of that West Nile virus, priority area. So high disease prevalence, low disease prevalence. And luckily what we found is that for the most part, if the habitat conditions are right, grouse are occupying those stands, which is good news. Basically, if you build it, they will come, which is why we focused a lot on habitat management in recent years. So yes, they are living outside of some of those areas. When we have a few years where the disease is lower, like the disease severity is lower, they're able to kind of move into those areas. It's just likely that anytime we get a severe disease years, it's more likely to knock back their populations in areas with high disease prevalence. So they'll always kind of have that push and pull.
Okay.
And the ones generally at higher elevations will just have to deal with that factor less.
Right. Thank you.
Very good presentation. Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anything that you can do biologically to make woodcock taste better?
I think we'd have to convince them to start eating something a little bit more delicious than earthworms and grubs. So I don't know. I'll see what I can do. I'll
All right,
talk to
thank
them.
Any other questions for Raina?
One final one for you. I'm going to apologize in advance, but with your expertise as far as wild turkey, ruffed grouse, and woodcock, if you were sitting up here and you were faced with reintroduction of martins, is that a concern for you?
Based on the testimony that I've heard from Dr. Joyce today and everything that I've learned reading the Martin management and reintroduction plan, I would say no. Just to repeat some of the messages that Dr. Joyce had here, grouse exist in densities much lower here in Pennsylvania than other parts of their range where they overlap with martin. And so the fact that they show up at such low percentages in those areas where they're more available to the generalists, the facultative generalists that martin are, yes, they will likely eat some grouse here in Pennsylvania, but because they exist at lower densities, they're not going to encounter them very frequently, or at least not as frequently as they do in other parts of their range. So I don't foresee any huge impacts as far as martin predating on grouse here in Pennsylvania. And I would say the same thing for turkeys. Turkeys are obviously more prevalent and abundant here, but just based on the literature and the fact that they haven't really been identified as something that martin are targeting, then I don't really have concern about that here. But I'll let Mary Jo maybe respond to that a little bit more.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Raina. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And our last staff report is migratory game bird regulations process 2024 waterfowl seasons. Amanda Hoyt.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda Hoyt. I'm the waterfowl biologist, and today I'm going to cover the process that we use to set the migratory game bird seasons and bag limits, and I'm also going to cover noteworthy changes to the seasons and frameworks compared to last year. But before that, I'd like to quickly tell you a little bit about myself since I'm really new here to the Game Commission. I just started here as a waterfowl biologist at the end of January of this year, and just prior to that, to accepting this position, I worked as Maryland DNR's waterfowl program technician over on the Eastern Shore, and before that, I received my master's degree studying American black duck brood survival and habitat use in coastal North Carolina, and all in all, I have over 7 years experience in waterfowl monitoring and research, as well as habitat management, and that was all through numerous state, federal, and private agencies. So that's just a little bit about me. So to get started, all migratory game birds are ultimately under federal authority and fall under purview of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And those include webless game birds such as sandhill cranes, woodcock, doves, snipe, gallinules, coots, and rails. And of course, we have our web species, or waterfowl, which are ducks, geese, and swans. Before we dive further into the season setting process, we need to talk about the flyways. And there are 4 flyways in North America, which those boundaries were determined through band recovery data. And you can see the simplified migration paths within the 4 flyways as an example on the right-hand side there. And as you can see, we're in the Atlantic flyway, so for waterfowl and those webless species that I mentioned just earlier, the Fish and Wildlife Service establishes a set of federal frameworks every year for each flyway. And frameworks include the maximum number of days allowed in hunting season, daily bag limits, earliest opening dates and latest season closing dates, as well as the number of splits any given season can have. So what all goes into the creation of these federal frameworks? It's an ongoing and complex process that I did my best to depict here with this graphic, using where we are today as an example. The blue star is supposed to represent us sitting here today within the 2024-25 season selection portion of the process. And we're close to finalizing those season dates and bag limits and are getting ready to start the breeding waterfowl population surveys. And then moving on to the next portion where the 2025-26 season process begins, there's going to be a summer flyway council meeting where we review data from previous hunting seasons, the breeding waterfowl surveys that we're just about, actually they start today and we'll be taking those into consideration. And then all the information will be used to update model weights, which then estimate waterfowl populations. So the flyway votes on recommendations, which are then considered through the Fish and Wildlife Service, through the Service Regulations Committee. And then that process will continue with winter waterfowl surveys and another flyway meeting next winter. So that was a brief summary of the federal process, but beyond that, each state needs to then individually select their own seasons within those frameworks. So for Pennsylvania, after we have those frameworks, we develop proposed seasons, and these seasons are derived primarily from the results of our waterfowl hunter surveys, as well as we incorporate public comments from past seasons as well. And after collecting those current public comments, we'll share those proposed seasons with senior staff, the regions, and the board for review and comment. And the official season selections are then placed into a selection letter, which is ultimately signed by our executives. So now I'm going to transition over to changes in the federal frameworks for this year. And we really only have one notable change, and that's the season length for the Atlantic population of Canada geese has been reduced from a 45-day season to 30 days, but our bag limit is still going to stay at 3 birds. So AP migrants are a population of geese that breed along the east and west coast of the Ungava Peninsula, which I circled up top there. But most PA wintering AP geese come from that east coast. And primarily they winter in New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia, Maryland, and southeast Pennsylvania, hence why we have that southeastern Atlantic population zone. So to provide some backstory, in 2018, the season length for that zone was reduced to 30 days and a 2-bird bag limit due to declines in the populations that were a result of nearly a decade of below average production, including a complete failure in 2018. The desired reduction in harvest wasn't observed, so the bag limit was decreased even further to one bird a day in 2020. And then we had COVID, which impacted our ability to do our normal monitoring program, so that led to a significant gap in the data. Right after COVID, a new population model recommended moderate season in 2022, but operating under an abundance of caution, the Flyaway Council voted to remain in the restrictive season. But surveys then started back up in the Ungava Peninsula in July, showing that the population was growing and exceeded that liberal threshold. So therefore, we had a liberal season of 45 days with a 3-bird bag. Last summer, however, we observed another decline in the population, which is why a 30-day season with a 3-bird daily limit is mandated by the federal framework for this year. And then I'm just going to run through these next 3 slides quickly. They're just summarizing the season dates and bag limits in each zone for the 2024-25 season. But here are our duck seasons, pretty much no real change compared to last year. And then here are dates for the early and regular seasons for Canada geese, where we have that one major change in the AP zone that I mentioned just before. And I should mention that the 15-day reduction in season length for AP geese was taken off of the regular season. And lastly, we had the season dates for light geese, where there's no changes from last year also. And that's all I have for you today, and I'll feel you can ask any questions or voice any concerns that you have now. And my contact information is there if you have any questions later.
Any questions for Amanda? We sort of died out in questions. I have one.
Okay.
So, forgive my ignorance. So the resident population that was in blue and the Atlantic population, that's the resident population, meaning the geese never leave Pennsylvania? Is that what you mean
They
by
breed
that?
here, yeah.
I'm sorry?
They breed here. Mhm.
Breed here, okay. So they're not migrant.
No, so the AP population, just because they're migrant, they're a lot more susceptible to, I guess, declines in their population from hunting,
Right.
which is why we have that special little
Yep.
zone.
So the resident population at the federal level, because it's controlled federally, so all the geese that seem increasing to me, crapping all over the sidewalks and walkways of towns and cities everywhere, how do we get at that? Or how does the federal government get at that? Because that population just keeps exploding. Anecdotally, what I see, and all the point in Pittsburgh and the walkways, what's that? Oh, sorry. I thought you had a solution. Yeah, so how does the federal government get at that, or can they get at that with that explosion? They're all over the golf courses and residential streets.
Yeah, so that is part of the federal framework as well. And I'm pretty sure it's based on a 3-year average and breeding population. It's just a certain number their population has to be at before they'll raise that threshold. And we can always be more conservative than that, like maximum framework.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious, thank you. Any other questions for Amanda?
I have a question. Well, actually a request. First of all, welcome. We're glad to have you here. I never hunted waterfowl growing up and spent most of my time deer and turkey hunting, but I would love to know more about, I would just love like a birds 101 from you at some point, just because this is, I want to know more, and I would love to hear from you more, because the only time we hear from this group is once a year when these are set, so I'd like to hear from you more often.
Okay.
Yes, agreed.
You did, what?
Go hunting.
Yeah, that too.
Okay, anything else for Amanda? Thank you very much for your time, Amanda. Yes, welcome. So if there's no further staff reports, that will end our public meeting of staff presentations. We'll adjourn, and we'll see you back here tomorrow at 8:30 for the public meeting, for those of you that wish to attend. Thank you.